Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I am Amy Seawright. I lead the Southeast Asia Program here at CSIS, and it's an honor to welcome you here today for our conference on the relationship between Vietnam and the United States towards strategic cooperation. The United States and Vietnam has undergone a remarkable trajectory in recent years. Next year will mark the 25th anniversary of the normalization of relations between our two countries after open conflict, and we now have a comprehensive partnership. Vietnam has figured very prominently in the last administration, President Obama's rebalance to Asia-Pacific, and this administration's free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. And President Obama visited Vietnam at the very end of his term. President Trump has just returned from a second visit to Vietnam, and he hosted Prime Minister Phuc here in Washington at the White House in 2017. So there's been a great deal of progress between our two countries, especially in the bilateral security and defense cooperation area, as well as cooperation on regional issues. So we wanted to focus on this aspect of the relationship today, which really highlights how much our interests are in alignment. At the same time, there are many challenges and obstacles, which we also want to look at today. Before I invite our guest speaker to the podium, I have to make a brief safety announcement. In the unlikely event of an emergency, I will be your safety officer, and if the emergency is happening behind me, we will exit out the front doors of CSIS, and if the emergency is in front of us, you can follow myself and CSIS staff out the back exit, where we will gather on National Geographic Building on M Street. But now it is my pleasure to welcome Assistant Secretary of Defense for Indo-Pacific Security Affairs, Randy Shriver. It is now the Indo-Pacific Security Affairs Office, IPSA. When I was there, it was called APSA. Randy has long been one of the United States' leading thinkers on the region, and so it's been no surprise that he has emerged as a really extraordinary public servant playing a critical role in this administration since becoming Assistant Secretary in January 2018. Prior to his appointment, Randy Shriver was one of 5 founding partners of Armitage International, LLC, and the CEO and president of the Project 2049 Institute. Previously, Randy served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs. And I also must mention that not only does Randy have a master's degree from the Kennedy School at Harvard, but he is a graduate of Williams College at approximately the same time that I graduated, so he is a colleague. With that, it is my great pleasure to invite Randy Shriver to the podium to deliver his remarks.
Thank you very much, Amy. Appreciate the introduction, and very much appreciate your continuing good work on Southeast Asia and this important relationship with Vietnam, and this event today gives us a great opportunity. I am surrounded by people who have made great contributions to the U.S.-Vietnam relationship and continue to make great contributions. Mr. Ambassador, good to see you this morning. So I'm reminded, we're mere stewards of these offices, short-term occupants of these offices, and we stand on the shoulders of others who've made tremendous contributions. Ambassador Dave Scheer, who served in Vietnam and then later served in the Pentagon, extraordinary contributions to the relationship at a critical time. My current colleagues, Luke Collin, our director, country director, Brigadier General Michael out from Indo-PACOM. When we talk about U.S.-Vietnam relations, some of these terms are cliche, but it's truly across government, whole of government, transitions across many administrations, truly bipartisan, truly multi-generational. It's really an extraordinary thing to see the consensus that has emerged around our policies and support for this relationship. As Amy mentioned, 25 years after the establishment of diplomatic relations, we're in such an extraordinary place, and it's really to the credit of many of the people in this room. And Admiral McDevitt had his own contributions in a variety of capacities. It's good to see you this morning, sir. Amy mentioned some of the milestones, but let me add a few more in our defense relationship, because the last 2 years there have been very significant developments. So we had our first aircraft carrier visit to Vietnam since the end of the Vietnam War, and we very much hope we can reach agreement with our colleagues in Vietnam for a second aircraft carrier visit this year. There was the first transfer of a major piece of defense equipment to Vietnam, a former Coast Guard cutter, a Hamilton class, that is now very active in promoting maritime security for Vietnam. We're hoping that there will be a second such cutter available. We saw the deployment of Vietnamese peacekeepers, a peacekeeping unit to South Sudan, and the United States had some role in supporting that organization along with other like-minded partners. We've upgraded the level of our annual defense talks, and as Amy mentioned, we've had unprecedented level of senior engagement, not only President Trump's 2 visits to Vietnam since he's been president, but last year alone, 2 visits from Secretary of Defense Mattis in 1 calendar year, again, pretty extraordinary. So in short, our defense relationship is strong and represents one of the strongest pillars in our multifaceted bilateral relationship. We think this is the case not only because of all the great work that everybody I mentioned has done and the personal contributions, but because it is really based on a foundation of common and shared interests. I think chief among those is our shared interest in promoting a rules-based order, protection of sovereignty, and individual rights of countries, no matter their size, and our shared concern that there's a potential erosion of a rules-based order, one that has allowed all nations in the Indo-Pacific to rise and prosper. We believe we share a view that for the Indo-Pacific to continue to flourish, each nation in the region must be free to determine its own course within a system of values that ensures opportunities for even the smallest countries to thrive and be free from the predations of strong countries. So in short, for Vietnam, what we want is a strong, prosperous, independent Vietnam, nothing else than that. And it's our aim for all nations in the region to secure the same so that we can enable the vast region's populace to live in prosperity and security. Southeast Asia and the adjoining maritime domain are the areas where some of these values and qualities are most challenged by actors that don't share our vision for a free and open Indo-Pacific. And we have particular concerns in this regard with respect to China. The region is increasingly confronted with a more assertive and confident China that is willing to accept friction in the pursuit of its interests. Nowhere do we see this more clearly than in the South China Sea. Despite General Secretary Xi Jinping's pledge made in the Rose Garden of the White House in 2015, China has indeed militarized the South China Sea. China has conducted land reclamation on an unprecedented scale and created severe environmental degradation in the process, including the destruction of massive amounts of coral reef. And it's militarized these artificial features to assert a sovereignty claim that is both expansive and contrary to law. Early last year, China delivered coastal defense cruise missiles and long-range surface-to-air missiles to its Spratly Island outposts, a clear sign again that its intentions are not benign. Working with our allies and partners, we will be resolute in standing up to these efforts to undermine the rules-based order and change the status quo. We have a particular response to fly, sail, and operate where law allows, and increasingly we're joined by others in those efforts, but we will continue to ensure that no one country can change law or change international norms unilaterally. But to be clear, our concerns go beyond a single body of water. The CCP, under the leadership of Chairman Xi Jinping, is challenging a rules-based order and working to transform this order toward one that's more favorable to its authoritarian model. And this matters because if the CCP's authoritarian approach became ascendant, we could see the following. We could see a weakening of regional and global sovereignty of countries and lead to a loss of access to the global commons. We could see an erosion of our system of alliances and partnerships. We could see an undermining of institutions that are highly valued, such as ASEAN, as well as its member states. And we could see a diminishment of the respect for individual and human rights, and even the potential normalization of the brutal repression underway in places such as Xinjiang and Tibet. While our Indo-Pacific strategy is inclusive and we seek a results-oriented, practical relationship with China, their behavior does not instill us with confidence. The ongoing repression in Xinjiang is a human tragedy unfolding before our eyes, and to suggest that this is mere job training is unbecoming of a country that aspires to great power status. The ongoing threats and military intimidation and coercion of Taiwan is destabilizing to the entire region. So when we focus on the South China Sea and the maritime domains, it's but a part of our overall concerns. We believe we have a strong partner in Vietnam in addressing these challenges and others. Building a strategic partnership with Vietnam is critical to our efforts to uphold the regional order. And as we work toward greater strategic cooperation, our department will focus on two important areas. First, we'll continue to strengthen our bilateral defense relationship by enhancing Vietnam's military capabilities and pursuing opportunities for military training and cooperation. In particular, our cooperative efforts will continue to focus on the areas that are most relevant to Vietnam, their security and regional stability, and this is very much an effort to implement agreements reached in 2011, our Memorandum of Understanding on Defense Cooperation, which my colleagues from the Obama administration exerted tremendous leadership on to see that to conclusion. The areas addressed in the Memorandum of Understanding include maritime security and maritime domain awareness, humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, peacekeeping operations, professional military education, including English language training, military medicine, and search and rescue. A stronger defense partnership based on these areas of cooperation, we believe, will help Vietnam protect its own sovereignty, deter aggression, and promote regional and global security, both unilaterally and jointly with the United States and other like-minded countries. Second, we will continue to promote Vietnam's global and regional leadership role, especially as it prepares to assume the ASEAN chairmanship in 2020, which is a very significant opportunity. Vietnam's leadership of ASEAN over the next year provides a timely opportunity to build consensus and solidarity among ASEAN member states in support of upholding a principled, rules-based order. ASEAN remains a key component and central to our efforts to promote the values enshrined in our Indo-Pacific strategy, freedom of the seas, good governance, market economies, and respect for an order based on clear and transparent rules. Complementing U.S. diplomatic efforts, our Secretaries of Defense have attended all the ASEAN Defense Minister Plus meetings, the ministerials, since its inception in 2010, and we have matched this participation with active engagement in the ADMM Plus subordinate mechanisms. In a large and interconnected region, especially with so many strong and capable and dedicated players, it's in our collective interest to network and link relationships to produce gains for all. It's our hope to work closely with Vietnam over the next year, and we will offer support as it's desired and requested as Vietnam crafts the ASEAN 2020 objectives and its agenda. In particular, we hope to partner with Vietnam on efforts to promote the common principles consistent with our free and open Indo-Pacific concept, to enhance regional efforts to share, sense, and contribute to maritime domain awareness, to establish regional English language training initiative to fill a key gap among many ASEAN member states, and to highlight Vietnam's capabilities and contributions to global peacekeeping efforts, particularly through its Peacekeeping Training Center in Hanoi. And although we're not a party to the ongoing China-ASEAN Code of Conduct negotiations, we do think the outcome will impact our interests and regional security writ large. So we will support Vietnam's efforts to conclude a code of conduct that is consistent with international law, legally binding, and secures the interests of those wishing to see a free and open Indo-Pacific maintained. To wrap up, I, again, am very honored to be amongst so many who have contributed so much to this relationship. I was mentored by people like Dr. C. Wright and Ambassador Scheer. In this job, I've had the opportunity to visit Vietnam 5 times in a year and 3 months, which is a pretty significant pace for an assistant secretary. But as mentioned, Secretary Mattis himself visited Vietnam twice last year, which is unprecedented. During his second visit, which I accompanied him on, I had the privilege of joining him for a tour of Bien Hoa Air Base and looking at our efforts at Dioxin remediation and the work we're doing to remove a health hazard and return to Vietnam a valuable facility for their use in the future. We also continue our important work on POW MIA cases, and we have an excellent partner in Vietnam in helping us resolve those cases and bring them to closure for the families who have continuing struggles associated with those losses. Those are important legacy of war issues that are aimed at not only correcting and dealing with our past, but to be enabling activities for our future. We have a partnership that is coming from a troubled past, but we're doing what we can to address those historical legacies and give us the opportunity to have a strategic partnership that is meaningful and consequential on the most important security issues in the region. So I look forward to continuing to engage. Ambassador Ngoc, our work continues, my colleagues in government, and we're looking forward to another very productive year, and I hope to hand this relationship off to my successor in as good a shape as Ambassador Scheer handed it off to me, because again, this is an enduring interest of ours, and we'll remain committed as a country, bipartisan, multi-generational, to ensure it remains strong in the future. So thank you.
Thank you, Randy. Said a number of interesting things there describing the relationship with defense and security cooperation in Vietnam and regional cooperation. I think on the defense cooperation side, 2 things leapt out at me. One was after the very successful visit of the USS Carl Vinson last year in Da Nang, the first aircraft carrier visit since the Vietnam War, as you said. You said you're looking to perhaps have a second visit this year. So I'd love to hear more about that. And the other thing that leapt out was English language training. I think that's a real challenge in our security cooperation and our broader cooperation, but our security cooperation with militaries, not only in Vietnam, but some of the neighboring countries, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar. So I wonder what you're looking for in that context to help boost English language training. If you could share any more on that.
Sure. With respect to a potential second aircraft carrier visit, we're in discussions with Vietnam right now. Our hope is that this can be a regular feature of the relationship. It would be a sign of a mature and strategic relationship. We'll work those details out with our partners in Vietnam, so hopefully we'll have something to say on that in the not too distant future. With respect to the interest in promoting English language training, we think there's an opportunity to not only strengthen that aspect of our cooperation in Vietnam and with Vietnam, but for Vietnam to potentially play a leadership role in the region by partnering with us to be a resource for the rest of ASEAN states. As you mentioned, others, the gap is probably more significant. So we're looking to commit some resources to have that ability to operate in Vietnam as a regional training center for all ASEAN states. And again, we'll work those details and have something to say about that in the future.
That's terrific. Another thing that leapt out is your mention of Bien Hoa. Secretary Mattis, as you mentioned, visited Bien Hoa, and there's been some discussion after the successful dioxin remediation in Da Nang that the U.S. Agency of International Development worked on. There's been some discussion about partnering with Vietnam on dioxin remediation in Bien Hoa, which really creates a lot of goodwill, I think, in the broader relationship, including on the defense side. So can you share with us any progress in terms of how this administration is working with the Vietnamese to tackle that issue?
It's well underway. So when Secretary Mattis visited, he was able to see where the particular areas of concentrated contamination was. where our contractor partners will be operating, and we have very good support for that, not only across the interagency, but on Capitol Hill. It's one of the things that our supporters in Congress are firmly behind. They understand the importance of this legacy of war issue, and again, we see it as not only dealing with something in the past, but being an enabling function for us to do the other things we want to do in the security relationship.
Mm-hmm. Terrific. And then in terms of Vietnam's recent role in hosting the summit between Kim Jong-un and President Trump, this was a moment for Vietnam really to step up on the international stage, show that it can handle a big summit like that, play a facilitating role. And the Trump administration, it was very interesting to see how they held up Vietnam as a role model for North Korea, given that it was able to maintain its regime, but really pursue economic openness and friendly diplomatic relations with its neighbors. Can you share from your perspective on the trip or other discussions you've had, how much did Vietnam embrace that role? And is there any sense that it resonated with the North Koreans? Is there any sense that Vietnam has actively been working with North Korea to try to engage them on this issue, as to portray itself as a role model in that sense?
Well, frankly, we didn't have to say much. Just by virtue of convening in Hanoi, it gave our North Korean interlocutors a chance to see, observe, understand the tremendous progress that Vietnam has made. Both Chairman Kim Jong-un and his delegation had opportunities for bilateral engagements with Vietnam. Those are discussions between Vietnam and North Korea, but I think among the things they talked about was the possibility of a brighter future for North Korea should they follow, maybe not necessarily exactly Vietnam's path, but something similar. And I would say in the defense space, when we talked about the Singapore agreement and how we could make further progress, remember one of the areas of agreement in Singapore was to work on POW MIA affairs. And we've had some progress with North Korea on that front with the return of some remains last summer. What we talked to them about, again, using Vietnam as an excellent case study, is how dealing with that in a forthright manner and bringing resolution to so many families who continue to suffer, how that is a pathway to improving the overall bilateral relationship, building trust. I mean, so much of what we hear from the North Koreans is the need to build trust. We believe trust is important, but trust but verify. One of the areas that I think was very key to our relationship with Vietnam was building trust through this cooperation, and we were able to talk to them about that. I think they couldn't help but to take that on board, just being immersed in that environment. How it's going to affect their thinking going forward, it's hard to say.
And then my last question before I'll open it up for other questions from the audience is about Vietnam hosting ASEAN next year, chairing ASEAN, and so being the host for the East Asia Summit and the ASEAN Defense Ministerial Meeting Plus, ADMM Plus, the meeting of defense ministers. It was interesting, last year at Shangri-La Dialogue, the Vietnamese Defense Minister, General Lick, talked about Vietnam hosting ADMM Plus in 2020, and that will actually be the 10th anniversary of ADMM Plus. Vietnam launched it when they last chaired ASEAN in 2010. And so he mentioned they were looking at that as an opportunity to really enhance the role of ADMM Plus. So it does seem like an opportune time to work with Vietnam and other ASEAN friends to take a look at the architecture on the security side and with an eye towards seeing how it can be further enhanced to promote dialogue and cooperation. I wonder if you have any initial thoughts about ideas that the United States might bring to the table or work with Vietnam on.
Sure. Again, we think it's a great opportunity for Vietnam to exhibit their leadership role, and we want to be supportive of that. As you know from your service in government, you start these conversations well in advance, and so we're already engaged with our partners in Vietnam about how we can be supportive of their agenda. So we've communicated our interest in seeing how ADMM Plus can promote the concepts of a free and open Indo-Pacific, particularly in the security area, maritime domain awareness, maritime security. We, of course, have used the forum in the past to talk about our engagement with ASEAN as an entity, and we've progressed in terms of our plans to exercise with ASEAN, and so we think there's an opportunity for Vietnam to carry that further. So I think, we're at a stage now where we're giving ideas and our thoughts, but it's really going to be for Vietnam to decide how to carry that forward, and I think we're well positioned to be a good partner on that.
Thank you. Okay, let me open it up for questions from the audience. Yes, over here. We'll bring you a microphone. If I could just ask you to briefly introduce yourself and ask a question.
Thank you. I'm Tom Reckford with the Foreign Policy Discussion Group. You mentioned U.S. support of the ASEAN Code of Conduct, but how far can it really go with Chinese opposition to a multilateral code and support of China's friends in Cambodia and Laos?
I mentioned U.S. support for Vietnam's efforts on a code of conduct with China that would be consistent with international law and not in any way contrary to norms with respect to operating in international waters. We do have concerns about China's ambitions in this potential agreement. We frankly would have concerns even if a quality agreement is reached, whether or not China would honor it. We often talk about the fact that although we signed UNCLOS but didn't ratify it, we honor it. China ratified it and doesn't honor it. So the entire exercise does give us some pause because we think China's ambitions are not necessarily benign with respect to a code of conduct, but we do have confidence in our partner in Vietnam that they will seek the kind of agreement that we could support. And so particularly as ASEAN chair, we think it's an important window, let me put it that way, for the United States to encourage Vietnam's leadership role in producing a quality code of conduct that's consistent with international law.
Very good. Other questions? Yes, this woman here.
Thank you, Kitty Wang with NTD TV. We know in a few days will be the 40th anniversary of the TRA, Taiwan Relation Act. But over the last weekend, we have seen the Chinese fire jetters, two of them cross the medium line of the Taiwan Strait. And so I'm just wondering, how do you see the U.S. can help to keep the stability across the strait? And also, how can U.S. further support Taiwan's self-defense capabilities?
Well, just briefly, since I want to talk mostly about Vietnam, we were concerned with anything that is destabilizing and threatens the peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait, and in particular, we're concerned about China's use of military means for the purposes of intimidation and coercion. I think clearly crossing the center line for the first time since 2011, and in that case it was thought to be perhaps by accident. This was very much planned, calculated, and with the purpose of intimidating Taiwan. We're opposed to that, and we would call upon China to take much more constructive approaches, including renouncing the use of force, reducing the military posture opposite Taiwan that threatens them, and to engage in meaningful dialogue with the elected officials on Taiwan.
Question here in the back.
Nguyễn Mạnh Hùng from George Mason University. You mentioned United States concern over the South China Sea. And you also say that U.S. want to respect international law. And I guess that also included the PCA judgment negating the validity of China 9-dash line. On the other hand, American pronounced policy has been American remain neutral among vis-a-vis sovereignty dispute among nations. How would you reconcile this seemingly contradictory foreign policies objective of the United States? Number two is that recently there has been some dire warning about the situation in the South China Sea. So first, Admiral Philip Davidson say that declared before Congress that China has now practically controlled the South China Sea. unless we risk war to reverse the situation. Recently, in March, an article in Wall Street Journal also highlight United States is ceding South China Sea to China. How would you comment on this seemingly pessimistic dire warning? Thank you.
Yeah. I'm happy to answer the second first, but I need a little help with the first question. Did you get?
Do you want to repeat your first question, sir?
Or just-
briefly?
The first is a seemingly contradictory foreign policy objective of U.S. On the one hand, you respect international law,
Yes.
therefore negating the Chinese 9-line claim. The second one, on the other hand, United States remain neutral in the sovereign dispute among nations. So this seems to be contradictory.
Is there a contradiction between rejecting the 9-line but remaining neutral on the actual
Yeah.
disputes?
Well, I don't know any country, I don't know any legal scholar, I don't know anyone outside of the Communist Party of China that thinks the 9-line is a legal, meaningful boundary in the maritime space. So and the history of it, of course, is a bit complicated. So I think what we're talking about with respect to the features is entirely different. So it's not contradictory to say that widely recognized international waters should remain such, and we shouldn't cede sovereignty based on a unilateral claim that is not based on law, versus how we approach disputed features, which is not exactly neutral. It's to say we don't take a position on sovereignty, but we do say it's a policy position of the United States that those should be resolved peacefully through dialogue, not through coercion or use of force. And where there are particular concerns of use of military means, we do keep options on the table. There's an ongoing discussion, for example, related to the Philippines and their claims and what we would do as an ally. And frankly, we will take particular concern if there's any activities that involve Chinese military forces and our allies' forces and personnel. And as Secretary Pompeo said in Manila, we'll interpret our treaty accordingly. The second question, now I'm forgetting the second question. I must be...
I apologize, I forget the second
yeah,
question
the second
too.
question was
Sir, your second question briefly was?
Yeah, sorry.
I'm so sorry. Well, I guess another way to ask the first question is, there have been some scholars that have called for the United States taking a more intermediary role in perhaps considering taking sides on some sovereignty issues, or playing a more active role in mediating disputes, because the very passive, we take no position on sovereignty, you work it out yourselves, in the view of some, has not been very effective at a time when China is acting so assertively. And so do you have any view on that argument?
Well, the position on not taking a position on sovereignty claims where there's disputes is a global policy. Mm-hmm. So to begin to alter that has global implications and implications beyond the South China Sea and the East China Sea. I think where our concerns are sort of pressing are in cases where somebody is trying to use military means to address those disputes. And I think those can be addressed without necessarily changing a global policy on how we approach sovereignty disputes. Mm-hmm. We will honor the aspects of our treaty that apply with Japan in the East China Sea. Mm-hmm. As Secretary Pompeo said, we'll honor our treaty with the Philippines. Mm-hmm. So I think that's where we are right now. Mm-hmm. If there's a need to adjust that, I think it would have to be with global implications in mind and with very senior leadership involved in that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Well, we are out of time. So before I ask you to join me in thanking Assistant Secretary Shriver, I just want to announce that we will move right into our first panel that will focus on U.S. security and defense cooperation, and my colleague Brian Harding will moderate that. But please join me in thanking Assistant Secretary Shriver for his remarks. Thank you so much. Thanks.
Our choreography is almost completed. As Amy mentioned, we're going to get started with our first panel of the day on defense and security cooperation between the United States and Vietnam. As your programs will note, we'll have a short coffee break after this panel. Then we'll head into a second panel that Amy will moderate on U.S.-Vietnam cooperation in the broader region before being honored to have Ambassador Nak give us some closing remarks at the end of the day. For those who don't know me, I'm Brian Harding. I'm the Deputy Director of the Southeast Asia Program here at CSIS. We're thrilled to have a really terrific panel here to bring different perspectives to dive in a little deeper on a lot of what Assistant Secretary Shriver set up for us before this. Just to my right will be our first speaker, Dr. To An Tuan from the Bien Dong Institute for Maritime Studies at the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam in Hanoi. He's been there since 2017. Previously had a very long career in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Our second speaker toward the end will be Brigadier General Stephen Michael, who is the Deputy J5 at Indo-PACOM. Previously, he was at USARPAC, so he's been at home in Hawaii for a few years now after a pretty extraordinary career with deployments across the Middle East and South Asia. And finally, we have Ambassador David Scheer, who is really one of the most distinguished diplomats of his generation. Among other things, served as ambassador to Vietnam and also Assistant Secretary of Defense for Asia-Pacific Security Affairs from 2014 to 2016. So without anything further, I'll turn it over to Dr. To give us a perspective of how this relationship is being seen from Hanoi.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Brian, and thank you all for having me this opportunity to speak to all of you about Vietnam and United States relations in peace and security. So I just would like to make 2 points. The first point is about how Vietnam sees its national security and defense in general. And the second point is about how Vietnam sees its partnerships with the United States in this context. So regarding the first point about how Vietnam sees its national security and defense, Vietnam has already published 3 white books about its about defense. So in this book, one of the most important point is that the approach is that it sees Vietnam's peace and Vietnam's national security and defense in the context of the war. That means that Vietnam see it as a part of the war. And in the war, as we can see now from 1945, there are 3 important features of the war. The first thing is that international relations has been based on respect for independence, sovereignty, territorial integrity, non-interference into internal affairs of each other, and peaceful settlement of disputes. Of course, there are some cases when those principles has been ignored. However, it is the general trend of world peace and security. The second feature is that also since 1945, there has been a complex system of international and regional organizations that striving to maintain peace, international peace and security. We can see that at global level we have the United Nations, and at regional level we have ASEAN and ASEAN-led mechanism. And the third feature is that the countries in the world now are striving for peace and development. And in that context, the Asia-Pacific, or now we call the Indo-Pacific, is a highlight in both the efforts for peace, prosperity, but also for some security challenges. Regarding the security challenges, Vietnam, I think, like when it put into the context of the world, Vietnam, like many countries, see its security challenges from territorial and maritime dispute, for some dispute in ethnic or religious regions. It's also the proliferations of weapons of mass destruction, international terrorism, and some non-traditional security threats like we have for the climate change or food security. And very recently there has been a revival of the major power competitions in the region and the world. So with that, Vietnam's approach to its national security and defense is that, I think it's two important points. The first thing is that Vietnam will try to maintain an appropriate level of military strength in order to protect the country. But more important is that it focuses on cooperations and dialogues with other countries both as in bilateral and multilateral forum as a way to protect its security and defense. So with that general context, how Vietnam sees the United States, I think Vietnam looks at the United States in three aspects. The first aspect is that the United States is one of the most important, or if you can say, the most important country in the world system. The second is that we, both Vietnam and United States, have a bitter history of war. And that war still have many legacies. And the third aspect is that I think I quite agree with Assistant Secretary Defense Shriver about that the two countries now share many things in common. The most important thing is that we share the wish to leave behind the past and try to develop peace and prosperity for the both nations. And I think in this regard, it is very grateful that there are many people from both sides that have been ardently and most of the time, I think, quietly work to address the war legacy and also try to develop the relations of the two countries. So with that view of Vietnam to the United States, I think there are four points that Vietnam and United States should do in promoting security and defense cooperation. The first is that we should keep in mind that the security and defense cooperation of the two countries is for peace and prosperity. The second is that we should address the war legacies. It includes that the MIA accounting, the UXO clearance, and the detoxifications of the Agent Orange, as the Assistant Secretary just mentioned. The third priority is that we should promote the bilateral cooperation in the areas. I think I quite agree with Shriver was saying about the UN peacekeeping operations. The United States have been very helpful for Vietnam in preparing Vietnam to contribute its troops to UN peacekeeping operations in South Sudan, and I think it should be promoted further. Other areas is including the disaster relief and humanitarian assistance. So those are the areas of bilateral cooperation. The last one is about to promote the cooperation in not bilateral but multilateral forum. We can see that Vietnam has been very helpful in hosting the second summit between President Kim and President Trump. But there are also many other forums for the Vietnam and United States to cooperate. We can see that the ASEAN-US forum, the ADMM Plus had just been mentioned, We also have the East Asia Summit, and the ASEAN Regional Forum, and the very big one is the United Nations. And with that, I think I just would like to conclude with saying that the year 2020 is a very important year for peace and security cooperation between Vietnam and the United States, because it is not only the 25th anniversary of the bilateral relations normalization, it is also the year Vietnam would be the chairman of ASEAN, and if elected, Vietnam will also be a non-permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. So that is an opportunity for Vietnam and the United States to develop security and defense cooperation in 3 levels: bilateral, regional, and also global level. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you very much. General Michael, what's the view from Hawaii with the guidance that comes out of the Pentagon from officials like Assistant Secretary Shriver?
Well, Brian, first of all, thanks up front for your kind words. Amy, thanks so much for this invite and the ability to participate in this distinguished panel. I'm honored to be here on behalf of Admiral Davidson, the commander of the Indo-Pacific Command, and I definitely bring with me the aloha spirit, if not the aloha weather. U.S. Indo-PACOM is the primary component of our government's efforts to ensure free and open Indo-Pacific. And free and open is more about what we're for and less about what we're against. Free and open is about sovereignty, the rule of law, transparency, good governance, and no coercion. Free and open is about our values, one of the 2 things that are essential and are core to our strategy and strategic direction. Our national defense strategy has 3 pillars, one of which is allies and partners. So our values and our allies and partners and friends are key as we move forward. And central to the Indo-Pacific strategy. We remain committed to Vietnam, and Vietnam has become one of our strongest partners in the region. We support a strong, prosperous, and independent Vietnam, and we're bound together by our shared values and interests. The international rule of law, freedom of navigation in the South China Sea and East China Sea, and we do support Vietnam's ASEAN chairmanship 2020. The Indo-Pacific Command has invested significantly to enhance Vietnam's defense capabilities, particularly in the maritime capacity. Our most notable is the excess defense article Hamilton-class cruiser, the construction of 2 Vietnam Coast Guard training and maintenance facilities, the transfer of 18 Metal Shark boats, and the first peacetime U.S. aircraft carrier visit. And as was mentioned, we're hoping for a second. We believe we have a clear roadmap for reaching the next set of milestones in the U.S.-Vietnam defense relationship, and we'll continue to work with the Ministry of National Defense to establish and identify those priority areas for assistance. The bottom line is we think our relationship with Vietnam portends all the hope and opportunities for the future. Again, I'm honored to be here today, and I look forward to further and a more in-depth discussion.
Thank you. Ambassador Scheer?
Thanks, Brian. First of all, it's a great honor to be sharing the room with Ambassador Ngop, who was my counterpart in the Foreign Ministry when I was in Hanoi as the U.S. Ambassador from 2011 to 2014. It's also an honor to be sharing the room with Assistant Secretary Shriver, whom I've known since the late 90s or early 2000s, and with Amy Seawright, who worked for me quite diligently when I was in OSD in what was then called APSA. Again, I was in Vietnam as ambassador from 2011 to 2014, and I was asked to discuss progress in U.S.-Vietnam defense and security relations, overall U.S.-Vietnam relations since 2011. And of course, there's been a lot of progress, but I'm going to talk about that progress in the context of some of the constraints on U.S.-Vietnam cooperation. And there are a number of them. As Dr. Duin said earlier, the legacies of the war and the mistrust remaining from the war are one of those constraints. When I arrived in Hanoi in 2011, we weren't yet remediating dioxin at Da Nang and Bien Hoa. When I left Hanoi in 2014, we were already working on Da Nang. We completed that in 2016, and I was delighted to hear that Secretary Mattis and Randy Shriver had agreed to support remediation in Bien Hoa. But dioxin wasn't the only issue. When I arrived in Hanoi in 2011, we still had a full embargo on arms transfers to Vietnam left over from the war. We still had remaining MIAs to find in Vietnam, as we do now, but we have fewer. Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia remain covered with unexploded ordnance. And people with disabilities, presumably some of them resulting from exposure to dioxin, required our assistance. We were giving it then, we're giving it now. We've come a long way since 2011, thanks to Ambassador Ngop's efforts, thanks to the efforts of my successors in Hanoi and to their colleagues in Washington. And I think remediation of dioxin at contamination at Da Nang and Bien Hoa played a big part of that. I think our lifting of the embargo played a big part of it, but also important for increasing trust were the multiple senior-most visits both ways between Vietnam and the United States. Those visits included the 2015 visit of then Secretary General, still Secretary General Chum to the United States, President Obama's visit in 2015, or was it 2016? 2016. The Hanoi summit, and you may quibble about whether the Hanoi summit, the substantive result of the Hanoi summit was a success or a failure, but certainly for the Vietnamese side is a big success. They worked that very well, and I think they made a name for themselves on the global diplomatic stage as a result. Finally, the upcoming visit of General Secretary and President Chum, which I expect will happen within the next couple of months, will be another important milestone, not just in forwarding the substantive agenda, but in helping to continue dissolving that mistrust between the two countries. A second constraint on cooperation is the U.S. strategic position in East Asia and the Indo-Pacific. Our approach and our position in Northeast Asia is different from our approach to Southeast Asia and our strategic position in Southeast Asia. In Northeast Asia, we have strong forward deployed military forces, numerous forward deployed military forces. We have strong, capable allies. Everybody knows why we'd go to war in Northeast Asia. It's a very strong Paul Nitze style of counter-hegemonic strategy. Southeast Asia is very different. We have many fewer forward deployed forces in Southeast Asia. We have weaker alliances, less capable allies, although we have some strong partners like Vietnam. And it's not entirely clear why we'd go to war in Southeast Asia, although I might like to hear from Amy on that subject, or from Brian, or from the General. It's not clear to me why exactly we might go to war in Southeast Asia, and I'm not sure that it's clear to the Southeast Asians either. So our approach to Southeast and Northeast Asia are very different, and they differ again from our approach to the Indian Ocean. This makes Southeast Asia primarily a diplomatic theater. It's a theater in which diplomatic maneuver is extremely important. We're performing a George Kennan style of counter-hegemonic strategy in Southeast Asia. And that's perfect for our approach to building a free and open region. I think, free and open Indo-Pacific, because with Vietnam, and as with all of the ASEANs, we are helping to bolster their state sovereignty. We're helping them to build local state capabilities, military and otherwise. We are engaging the region in a way that gives countries like Vietnam the confidence they need to pursue their interests vis-a-vis China as vigorously as possible. And we're having some success with this as well. A third constraint on U.S.-Vietnam cooperation is the China factor. As the American diplomat George Ball once said, nothing propinks like propinquity, and nothing propinks on Vietnam like China. The Chinese believe they have a say in how far Vietnam goes, and the Vietnamese listen to that. They may not always adhere to what the Chinese want, thankfully, but they listen, and that's an important factor in Vietnamese decision-making. That's why Vietnamese limit foreign ship visits to Vietnam to 1 per year. We can be flexible with that, but basically they limit ship visits to 1 per year. That's why we'll probably never have an alliance with Vietnam. I'm not sure Vietnam wants an alliance with us. It may be desirable for us to keep that option open, though. The China factor is why we likely won't permanently station U.S. forces in Vietnam, although that too is a potentially a desirable option. And the China factor also explains why the Vietnamese are so careful about what their military services do with our military services operationally. That's okay. Building a cooperative relationship in defense and security on this has been sometimes challenging. It's required patience, but I think both sides are willing to look at expanding the envelope, and that's what we're doing. Human rights. Vietnam's human rights practices are a constraint, or a potential constraint. And it's something we share an interest in a rules-based order in the region, but our political philosophies are very different, and that's something we're going to have to continue to manage. So, in conclusion, I think that the relationship with Vietnam, including our defense relationship, demonstrates how successful we can be in a theater that is not our highest priority, where our military forces are limited, in a situation in which we have limited commitments, and where we have willing and able partners. It would help if President Trump could publicly endorse the national security strategy. I haven't heard him do so yet. It would help if our allies could be given the sense that if we could continue to bolster rather than weaken the credibility of our alliances and our commitment to the region. And it would help if President Trump could appear at the East Asia Summit and the APEC summits in the future. It's vitally important to our allies and partners in the region that the President be seen to be engaged in the region, that the United States be seen to be engaged in a region in which diplomacy is our main tool, diplomacy, albeit backed by military force. We need to be seen to be engaged. And a senior Vietnamese diplomat once explained this to me in very simple terms. I asked him once, do you really think that the United States can stop the Chinese from militarizing the features it occupies in the South China Sea? And he said, no. And I said, well, what's the point of the U.S. making all of the complaining so loudly in public? What's the point of the U.S. conducting FONOPs on those features? And he said, it's very simple. As long as the region and Vietnam know that the United States is engaged, China treats us better. It's that simple. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much. It's clearly incredibly liberating to be a former official, and I would certainly associate myself with much of what you had to say. And I think it's important as we think about this defense relationship, security partnership, while the sky seems to be the limit and the interests are quite aligned, we're really just getting going. I mean, as Assistant Secretary Shriver discussed earlier, we're still trying to implement those MOUs from 2011. There's still a number of constraints on the relationship, as you outlined. I thought it would be good to just start with giving Dr. Tuan an opportunity to maybe respond to some of the points that Ambassador Scheer was just raising about some of the constraints on the relationship. I think for a Washington audience in particular, just understanding how the China factor affects how much Vietnam can do with the United States would be something we could really learn from. So.
Yeah, thank you very much, and I thank Ambassador Scheer for his thought about the constraints in Vietnam and United States relations. I think I quite agree with him. The first one regarding the legacy of the war. I have already mentioned in my previously about it, and the issues of the legacy of the war now, I think for the MIA accounting, they have a lot of progresses regarding the accounting of MIA from the American side. However, for the Vietnamese side, there are many challenges, but no challenges. Regarding the USO, yes, of course, it has been, Vietnam is one of the most affected countries by it. And we have already seen the United States trying a lot to help Vietnam with that. Also the issues of people with disability, and also I think also the victims of Agent Orange also too. Of course, there are still controversy regarding what is actually the impact of the Agent Orange on people. However, the issues of Agent Orange on people in Vietnam is also one of the issues that is very important. I agree with Ambassador regarding the issues of U.S. approach to the South China Sea, to the Southeast Asia. I think because the United States has a very different approach, and also to not only to Southeast Asia, but also because it is a major power in the world. So it has, I think, also global vision, while Vietnam is just only one among many countries in Asia. That will be another constraint in the U.S. relations. Regarding the issues of China, I think, yeah, of course, because as I mentioned, U.S. and is a major power, so it views China very differently. Regarding the human rights issues, yes, of course, I think there it's maybe a little bit different what you said about the political philosophy. I think human rights, Vietnam has already recognized that there are differences in human rights and different approach to it. There is no perfect system. Every system has some things that need to be improved, and Vietnam has been trying very hard to improve that the human rights situations, and we recently have already support our report to the human rights for the periodical review of the United Nations, and also for the Committee on political and civil rights. So with that, I think I agree with the ambassador about the point, and that's it. Yeah.
General Michael, one thing you alluded to, and I think Assistant Secretary Shriver as well, was working together to build Vietnam's military capacity. Do you have any particular areas, if you were, had all the power in the world tomorrow, that you would want to make sure that Vietnam was focusing on this rather than that?
Well, I think one of the key things that ASD Shriver mentioned, and actually myself and him, had a trip together in the region, So the first thing was listening. So as we work with our partners and as we look at the Indo-Pacific, as you go from Northeast to Southeast to South Asia and then Oceania, our allies and partners have different interests and different requirements. So as we've heard from Dr. To, the area that Vietnam needs help and is focused on, maritime security, maritime domain awareness. They're heavily involved and play a significant role in peacekeeping operations and also in HADR. So those are the areas that we're focused on and trying to help them. So it's not about what's good for us, but it's really what's good for our partners. And the key thing is we interact with our allies and partners, and as you've heard, Vietnam has got strong interest in establishing bilateral and multilateral relationships. We think those are the things that pushes the environment towards stability. So we're listening to our partners, and we're focused on what's important to them, and focused on enabling bilateral and multilateral relationships, which is going to move us towards security and stability.
Speaking of capability, surprised one thing that didn't really come up, although Ambassador Shriver, you alluded to it briefly. I mean, it was with great fanfare that the ban on lethal arms sales was lifted here in Washington, but we really haven't seen much movement on that. And so, Dr. Taiwan and Ambassador Shriver, I'm wondering if you could just share some thoughts on why, where is it coming, or what the considerations are in Hanoi, because there's clearly both, there's a lot of interest in Washington in getting this to be a more productive part of the relationship. Ambassador, you want to
Sure. I think one factor in the slowness with which Vietnam has picked up on this is the fact that they don't have a lot of money to spend. The Vietnamese government is fiscally constrained right now. And it's hard for them, I think, to come up with the money particularly for major American weapons platforms. That hasn't stopped them from looking at other more modest platforms like drones, and like Coast Guard cutters, for example. So I think there's still, even given Vietnam's fiscal stringency, there's still a lot of opportunities there. A second factor is that Vietnam for a long time bought foreign weapons almost exclusively from the Soviet Union and then Russia. And their weapons procurement system is sort of entrenched in that way of buying weaponry from overseas. And it's going to take them some time to shift from a Russian way of doing things to an American way of doing things, which I think a lot of people in this room recognize is an extremely complicated and intimidating process for a country like Vietnam that hasn't dealt with us for a long time in this area. So those are some of the constraints. I've used the word constraints a lot today, but those are some of the constraints on quick, high visibility arms sales to Vietnam. But I think over the medium to long term, there's a great deal of potential here, and we've already started exploring that potential in the provision of $10 million, I think in 2017, for the transfer of the Hamilton-class cutter. That's under the Maritime Security Initiative. The provision of $80 million in new foreign military financing over the next 5 years, which is recent. And I think that as Vietnam works through what its requirements are for the use of that $80 million, we'll both learn a lot about what Vietnam's military missions are, what their requirements are to fulfill those missions, and what we can do to help.
What's the view from Hanoi on this?
Yeah, I think I quite agree with the ambassador regarding the 2 points he mentions. Financial constraints, I think is very important. Vietnam is not as rich as America. So to buy the new weapons, that particularly those very expensive weapons for poor, they need to be very considerable. The second thing is regarding the, I can call it the coordinations. of those weapons. Of course, Vietnam have a lot of weapons that left from the war, and so it's heavily influenced by the Soviet style. For the American weapons, it's need to be considered in order to put it into the maximum capability so that it can serve the purpose of the defense. And it's just not only about that you have a new ship or new weapons, that it will be very beneficial to the defense systems, but you need to get familiarized with it, to train how to use it. So it takes some time in order for Vietnam to consider about that, particularly about the buying weapons from the United States.
I recognize that we have a very full room here with an incredible amount of expertise, and so we have almost a half an hour, so I'd like to open it up for questions. I think we have microphones going around. I'll start with Admiral McDevitt.
Thank you, Mike McDevitt. First, I'd like to thank all three presenters for the excellent comments, and especially Ambassador Shriver for his, I thought, really insightful strategic analysis of Northeast Asia versus Southeast Asia. Question has nothing to do with anything that any of you raised. What role has the Vietnamese diaspora in the United States played over the years in contributing to the close relationship that between Washington and Hanoi today? And I suspect, Ambassador, you saw a lot of this in action on the ground, but I'd like to hear from any or all of the panelists on that.
Great question. Ambassador, do you want to start?
Well, it's very complicated, and it differs across generations. Of course, the older generation of the Vietnamese diaspora have strong feelings about the war, about the Vietnamese Civil War that took place, and many of them remain deeply embittered by what happened to them. Others are less embittered and more moved by old-fashioned traditional Vietnamese nationalism. So that when I was visiting Orange County, when I was an ambassador, I was treated to a lecture on the importance of the Paracels and Spratlys by a 70-year-old Vietnamese American who knew every feature and was familiar with the international law associated with the problems in the and conflicts in the South China Sea. So even in the older generation, it's complicated. And now with the younger generation coming on, they're bringing with them a different set of perspectives. They're looking at some of the, they're concerned about things like human rights in Vietnam, but they're also looking at economic opportunities there for themselves and for Americans in general, so that at a roundtable of young Vietnamese American entrepreneurs I attended in San Francisco once, we broke up and I was walking out with a young Vietnamese and he said, I've been very successful doing business in Vietnam, but I don't know what to say to my parents. I'll stop there.
Do you want to add anything?
No, maybe I would leave it to Ambassador Ngoc.
Good, yeah. He still has
in the next section.
Still has some time to add to his remarks. Linda?
Thank you for this excellent session. My name is Linda Yar. I'm at George Washington University. And one area of cooperation that had been mentioned was that of disaster relief and humanitarian assistance. To what extent, in terms of looking at constraints, how does the fact that our current administration is loath to talk about climate change, how does that impact cooperation with a country like Vietnam, where climate change has been very much recognized and is certainly one of the most severely impacted countries in the world for this phenomenon?
go on. And maybe a linking question is how the Lower Mekong Initiative is being perceived by the government in Vietnam. It's continued on, but certainly not with the same megaphone as the previous administration.
Yeah. I think because now we talk about the peace and security issues, and with that, disaster relief and humanitarian assistance is just not only focused on climate change. Climate change is just only one of the many reasons for Vietnam's natural disasters, and also one of the many reasons that Vietnam also needs for humanitarian assistance. So with that, the assistance from whenever the Obama administration or the Trump administration to Vietnam is very appreciated, because Vietnam's capacity in disaster relief and humanitarian assistance is also needed in many ways. So I don't think that climate change, the approach of the current administrations regarding climate change will affect much about the assistance and the cooperation regarding the humanitarian assistance and disaster training.
To add real briefly from Indo-Pacific Command's perspective, so we think we can do two things at once. So the bottom line is if there's a disaster, it's real and it's happening, and what we really focus on is meeting the need and responding to the need. And we can do that even if there's discussions about what truly or ultimately caused it. And we do think being present, being there for our partners in a time of need is also something that helps the relationship and reinforces that we've all got skin in the game.
Can I comment on that briefly? Vietnam is a frontline state when it comes to the negative effects of climate change. And we're already seeing it. I think the Vietnamese are acutely aware of the challenge, particularly with regard to the lower Mekong Delta. You have sea level rise already affecting the Delta. And I think that one provincial governor told me once that he expected that his province would have to build 50 miles of dikes in order to hold back the sea level rise. Salination of the soil in the Mekong Delta is a major problem, as is flooding. And I think it's been estimated that by the year 2050, as much as 1/3 or more of the Mekong Delta could be submerged by up to a meter of water, of sea, as a result of climate change. And the Obama administration worked on this with the Vietnamese. It's not clear to me to what extent the Trump administration is doing so.
Amy Seawright?
This is probably mostly for General Michael, but perhaps Dr. Tong has some comments on this as well. It says many of you have talked about the steady uptick in defense cooperation and many of you have talked about the steady uptick in defense cooperation, and Secretary Shriver talked about that as well. I think a recent progress has been encapsulated by the fact that we now have a 3-year plan for defense activities, which we never had before. So we can really plan on a 3-year cycle. And obviously the aircraft carrier visit was a milestone, but we're doing more at-sea naval engagements. So my question is, can you share a little more with us about what that trajectory looks like? What kinds of naval engagements are we doing? Are we, despite the constraints that Ambassador Scheer laid out, which persist, are we beginning to plan for, say, naval exercises? What kinds of activities are we doing, and how would you describe that trajectory going forward?
That's an excellent question. I mean, I think so number one is we're talking, and the fact that we've got ability to plan out multiple years, that gives us really the ability to lay some solid plans in place. The things that are in the realm of the possible is having them partner with us in exercises, looking at things like RIMPAC, thinking through potentially some shipwriter agreements, because both of what we're looking to do in increasing their capability, a lot of it is training, a lot of it is exposure, and then being involved in multilateral exercises. So I would say, we're almost at the beginning of the journey. We're meeting and and discussing the way ahead, and the things that I've highlighted is what's in the realm of the possible. We do not yet have some very solid things moving forward, but we've got some plans that we're looking to mature.
And there's a first ever U.S. ASEAN naval exercise coming up. Is that something that?
Right.
Works,
That is also in the works.
Will that be under this year Thailand's chairmanship, or would that be next year?
It will be next year in Vietnam's chairmanship.
That's terrific. Des?
Thank you. Good morning. So a question / comment about the economic context of the
Des,
U.S.
introduce yourself for the group.
Oh, excuse me. I'm Des Walton from Bauer Group Asia. Regarding the economic relationship between the United States and Vietnam and how that may impact the ecosystem for security cooperation and other things to develop. So, my observation is that the economic relationship is on a dramatically upward trajectory. Vietnam's economic growth is pretty impressive. The demographics are impressive. The desirability of Vietnam as an investment destination from the United States and others is increasingly attractive. So, and trade, I think, has reached an important benchmark of exceeding $60 billion a year in bilateral trade. So my question is, it seems to me that that would set the conditions for advancements in security cooperation. But I want to ask the panel if indeed you think that this burgeoning, deepening economic relationship will indeed have a positive impact, or if it's just something that won't.
Ambassador Shriver, you want to start?
Well, I agree, Des. And I think the current frictions in U.S.-China bilateral trade relations offer Vietnam a big opportunity, particularly with regard to the shift in supply chains from China to elsewhere. I think Vietnam is already benefiting from that. I also agree that the economic relationship it provides a good basis for building in other areas. I think, of course, benefiting from the economic relationship with the United States is a primary Vietnamese objective. And third, I think the Vietnamese view the economic relationship, not only in economic terms, but in strategic terms, as a way of diversifying their trading partners. That's how they viewed the TPP. They were deeply disappointed. Well, I was responsible for bringing the Vietnamese on board TPP negotiations. And they understood the strategic argument for TPP membership immediately, sooner than many Americans did. But even in the absence of TPP, they see their participation in TPP, the Japanese-sponsored successor to TPP, in strategic terms. I think they see potential. You'll have to ask our Vietnamese participants this question, but my sense is they see potential strategic and economic value in a bilateral free trade agreement with the United States.
Yeah, I just want to add a few more points. The first point is that, as I mentioned earlier, Vietnam sees its national security and defense in a broader context. It means that it's not only focused on military strength, but also relations and particular peaceful environment. So with the promotions of economic contacts between the two countries, I think it will definitely make positive impacts to the relations in peace and security. Many other things also added to it, particularly the relation between people and people. I just take my opportunity to come back to questions Amy just raised, and I haven't had a chance to answer. I quite agree with the general regarding its it is now kind of the new beginning for us. Vietnam recently participated in the RIMPAC, and as you mentioned about the possibility of ASEAN-US joint exercise, one of the things I think is that for the potential cooperation in the future is that Vietnam has a very long coastal area. And so to support the Vietnam Coast Guard is very important. Both as to have provide us with new ships. We have already provided us some ships, but the more the better. The second thing is that we should also, the United States can also help Vietnam regarding training for the Coast Guard. And also English training is also very important. Yeah.
Terrific. I mean, to Des' point, the people-to-people point you make, I think, is really important too. I mean, the deeper economic integration will help deepen the connective tissue between our countries, which we just don't have yet. Again, the sky's the limit, but we're just getting going. And having Americans traveling to Vietnam to do business builds people-to-people ties, builds trust, and hopefully leads us somewhere on the security side of the relationship as well, I think. Hunter, I saw your hand.
Hi, Hunter Marston, independent consultant and PhD candidate at Australian National University. Question for Dr. Tuan. I tend to hear competing interpretations of Vietnam's strategic outlook towards China and the United States. One camp holds that Vietnam is the most forward-leaning of Southeast Asian countries who want to push back against China. And another camp, as Ambassador Scheer alluded to, holds that Vietnam will be cautious lest it provoke China's ill will. Could you speak a little bit to Vietnam's views on U.S. staying power and military presence in the region as a potential balancer against China? Thank you.
Regarding that issue, I think we should look at Vietnam's national security and defense is not from the point of a major power, but a country, I think I just mentioned, a country in the just one among many countries in the world. So with that, it means that what is most important for Vietnam's national security and defense is to have a peaceful international environment. And the second is that to promote cooperation with all other countries. So with that, I don't think that Vietnam want to be either forward in pushing back China or just doing something else. So what we try to do is to have very friendly relations with all others, with that including China and also United States.
All right. Who's next? Right here, front table. Microphone's coming.
My name is Michael Zan. I'm an undergraduate student at George Washington University. So my question is about one of the U.S. major concerns, the China's Belt and Road Initiative. So as you may know, Vietnam has refused to join the China's Belt and Road Initiative due partly to the fear that the possible political intervention of the South China Sea dispute, and also due partly to the fear that Vietnam is not able to pay back the inflated debt. But recently, even Italy, a long-term U.S. ally, and Luxembourg has signed to join the China's Belt and Road Initiative. So regarding to this, what is U.S. and Vietnam's respective role in preventing the expansion of China's soft power, namely the China's Belt and Road Initiative?
I think this is an issue that we'll dive into in the second panel, but Ambassador Scheer, you want to give a shot here?
I think we'd be facing similar challenges whether China had a Belt and Road Initiative or not. They're sitting on an extremely vibrant economy. They're sitting on a lot of foreign exchange reserves, and they have a lot of excess industrial capacity. And all of those argue for a Chinese economic thrust into it, at a minimum, into its periphery and across the Eurasian continent to Europe. And China would be attempting to use those economic ties to influence countries that are beneficiaries of this, whether there were a Belt and Road Initiative or not, I think. I respect Vietnam's caution with regard to joining the Belt and Road Initiative. I think there's a lot more the United States and our allies, developed allies in the region, can do to balance Chinese economic influence in the region. We've made a start with the Asia Reassurance Initiative Act, passed by Congress and signed by the President last year, which provides some funding for the purposes of, I believe, infrastructure development in places like Southeast Asia. We've made a start through the BUILD Act, which also which provides $60 billion globally for infrastructure projects. That's not a lot, but it's a start, and it shows that we're engaged. Meanwhile, we're also cooperating with the Japanese, and I believe the Australians, in devising ways of working together to help Southeast Asians build out their infrastructure. So there are efforts being made in that regard, but there's more that we can do. And I'll tell you a story. I worked very hard trying to get the Exim Bank more interested in Vietnam when I was ambassador. I sent a cable in which made Exim Bank irritated about urging them to do more in Vietnam. And I got a senator, who will remain nameless, in my car, who was visiting Hanoi. On the way to the foreign ministry, I gave him my Exim Bank speech on the need for more American economic involvement, more American government economic involvement in backing financial arrangements. And he turned to me and said, Exim Bank is just welfare for Boeing. What kind of foreign trade strategy is that?
So one thing I would add, is I would not that we're against the Belt and Road Initiative. I mean, what we're for is things that aren't predatory, no coercion. So a lot of what we're for, the Belt and Road, appears to be against, but the intent is not we're against China and the Belt and Road, but we're for sovereignty. We're for things that are free and open, no coercion, transparency, and a lot of what happens in the Belt and Road moves in that direction. So there's still room, for China to kind of join the international community, but I would not necessarily frame it as we're against China. How do we stop their progress? To Ambassador Sher's point, it's natural that they expand, but I think if it's done a certain way, then it'll be a lot more inclusive, to the international community.
I just want to add a few more points regarding the Belt and Road Initiative. First of all, I do not think that Vietnam refused the Belt and Road Initiative. Actually, Vietnamese president has attended the Belt and Road Summit, and Vietnam is supporting that initiative. The reason is that Vietnam supports all initiatives that promote peace and security of the region. So, but what happened is that Vietnam is not a forerunner. Because why? Because as many regional countries experiences have shown that the China's project under the Belt and Road Initiative had some problems. And for Vietnam, I think it's very important is that it's not about that we have project, but what is the impact of the project. So that is the process. It's a little bit slow, but we support it.
We'll do one more question right here and then come back to our panel for any final brilliant thoughts they want to inject.
I have one question concerning oil exploration in Southeast Asia. How is the cooperation between the United States and Vietnam regarding that issues. Is China an obstacle to that problem? Thank you.
I'm sorry, at the beginning, did you say oil exploration?
Oil exploration.
Oil and gas.
In South China Sea.
Okay, got it. Professor Shriver?
Well, with regard to cooperation, American oil firms, energy firms' cooperation with Vietnam, it's pretty strong. Exxon is in the process of completing a large natural gas project off the coast of Da Nang, which will involve electric power generation once the gas reaches land. So that's a very big project. It's called the Blue Whale Project. I believe that Murphy Oil is also engaged in exploration off the Vietnamese coast. So I think American cooperation with Vietnam is pretty robust.
John, do you want to add anything to that, or maybe any final thoughts you may have wanted to share before we take a break?
Yeah. So what I would say is, as we look at our free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, the intent is free and open, which is really, as we look at the Indo-Pacific, and what happens there is probably going to have a greater impact on the planet than any other region on the planet. So the intent is keeping it free and open so that everyone can benefit. Our national security strategy, national defense strategy says we're in competition with China. And competition doesn't necessarily means we're seeking conflict. In many respects, competition is what's going to forestall conflict, because in competing, we protect and we act in protection of our interests, which probably leads to more stability. And a key part of our strategy is values and allies and partners. And we think those are two areas that China cannot compete. So values is all about our values. Sovereignty, governance, giving people the right to choose, free from coercion. And then obviously, what we understand, as we move forward, is that we have to be aligned with our allies and with our partners. So this is not about America going it alone. This is not about the American way in the Indo-Pacific. It's really allowing nations to choose their own path and to choose their own way.
Oh, I think U.S.-Vietnam relations, a lot of momentum in U.S.-Vietnam relations was generated by Vietnam's successful hosting of the Hanoi summit. And I think that if President Chum visits here during the summer, it will carry that momentum on. And I look forward to seeing the results of President Chum's visit and to further progress in the development of U.S.-Vietnam relations.
Yeah, I just want to emphasize the last 2 points. The first thing is that regarding Vietnam and U.S. relations, Vietnam view it from the aspect of independence, respect for independence, sovereignty, territorial integrity, and non-interference into internal affairs. And the second point is that Vietnam's support all the initiative for the peaceful environment of the regions that aim to promote the peace of all the countries, including even the BRI, if it's for that purpose, or even the Indo-Pacific if it's open. So that is the point.
Great. Well, I think we got a very good flavor of the state of play in the defense and security partnership. Clearly aligned interests, a lot of good progress, but also still some impediments. And it'll take time, but we're moving in the right direction. I think Ambassador Ngoc will remind us later that the defense and security partnership, the strategic cooperation, is really part of a much broader relationship that we all should be excited about. So we're going to take a 15-minute break and reconvene at 10:35. But before we do, please join me in thanking this fantastic panel.
Thank you. Thanks, Ambassador. Appreciate it.
Okay, we're going to get started on our second panel. We have three terrific speakers to talk about the relationship between the United States and Vietnam on a more regional level, how our countries are or can be, should be working together to promote our shared interests, our common vision in the region in various ways. So let me introduce our panel first, and then I'll turn to them for remarks. We have a Georgetown professor and my CSIS colleague, Dr. Michael Green, he's the Director of Asian Studies at the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University and Senior Vice President for Asia and the Japan Chair here at CSIS. Mike served on the NSC staff as Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Asia after he had been the Director for Japan, Korea, Australia, and New Zealand in the NSC. To Mike's right is Evan Medeiros, who is another Georgetown professor. He is the Penner Family Chair in Asia Studies at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University, where he does research and teaching on international politics of East Asia, U.S.-China relations, and China's foreign and national security policies. And Evan was also Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Asian Affairs at the National Security Council in the Obama administration. And prior to that, he served as the Director for China, Taiwan, and Mongolia. After leaving the White House, Dr. Medeiros also advised many of the world's most important companies as Managing Director for Asia Pacific at the Eurasia Group. So I'm going to turn to Mike and Evan and ask them in a moment to give remarks, but let me also introduce our third panelist who's going to give remarks after this session to close today's conference. We have Ambassador Ha Kim Nok, who has been ambassador here in the United States since January 2018, and I will give him a longer introduction when we bring him to the podium to give some remarks. But let's start with hearing from Mike Green.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Ambassador and Evan. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I love working on Vietnam. It was one of the most strategically interesting experiences I had in the 5 years I was on the National Security Council staff under President Bush. It's a very strategic country in terms of location. If no one yet in this conference has said the joke you hear in Hanoi, I should probably be the first. Why is Vietnam shaped the way it is? 3,000 years of China sitting on its back. So it's a geopolitically and geographically critically centered country, and it's a nation with a very strong sense of geopolitics and strategy, and acts like a great power in many ways. So if you're in the NSC staff, as Evan and I were, Vietnam is an exciting account to work on. I watched and worked on Vietnam policy for 5 years, and Evan about 6 years. There was a little gap in between when neither of us were in government, but what we thought we might do is frame our remarks about the evolution of U.S. strategy towards Asia and relations with Vietnam to give a sense of the trajectory of the relationship up till now, and also some of the issues that we both thought when we were on the job would define U.S. relations with Vietnam in the future. Some of them have come to fruition, some have not. And so I'll go first since I'm older and was on the job first. For the Bush administration, the first big diplomatic step forward was the visit of Pham Van Khai to Washington in 2005. It was the first visit since the Vietnam War of a leader from Hanoi to Washington. So it was loaded with geostrategic significance and some political complications. One of the things I had to deal with, which Evan told me he didn't really when we were talking about this, were all the domestic constituencies that were very, very powerful in the debate about Vietnam since the Vietnam War. In advance of Prime Minister Pham's visit, I had to go as the White House representative out to talk to the POW MIA community, to Vietnamese Americans. And to be honest, in 2004 and 2005, we didn't know how that would go. The relationship was still raw enough. I'll tell one silly story briefly. I grew up in DC and Chevy Chase, Maryland, which means I have a homogenized, bureaucratic English accent, American accent. But when I went to the POWMAA community to explain why we were inviting Pham Van Khai, what we're trying to do, I was quite nervous. My dad had been in Vietnam as a Marine, but it was before my time, and my counterpart from the Pentagon who'd gone in to brief them told me it went very badly for him. He was very severely criticized. So I went out, and as I got nervous, for whatever reason, I started delivering our strategy towards Vietnam with a accent that somehow was vaguely Fort Bragg, North Carolina, but was not real. And just as I was getting nervous, and try to
like right now, Mike?
Yeah, no, this is my real accent. To try to enhance my credibility or something. It was not intentional. And at the end, the denizen, the leading light of the POWMA community who'd lost her son, who had disappeared as a fighter pilot early in the Vietnam War, came up to me after the talk with a cane, and shook her cane at me and said, "Young man, it's not pronounced Vietnam. It's pronounced Vietnam. We need to show respect to these people." And it was sort of one of those moments where you realize, thank goodness I didn't get hit with a cane. But something's changed. Something's changed in the fabric of American society and our love and painful relationship with the Vietnam War. And I was really delighted to hear from Evan that as he was working on his summit tree with Vietnam, this was much less of an issue. It's not completely gone, of course, but the evolution of U.S. relations with Vietnam is also the story of American society, POWMIA, Vietnamese Americans. It's a story of healing, though not complete, that's quite powerful, that's important to note. The other guy, Ray Burkhardt, who many of you know, who was ambassador in Vietnam, really deserves a lot of credit for socializing Washington and Hanoi to what had to be done to have a successful visit. It was not easy in some respects. Hanoi at that point was very worried about China. Beijing was beginning to propose the East Asia Summit through the ASEAN senior official meetings, and was using Cambodia and Laos and Burma at the time to table a proposal that the East Asia Summit would be always held in ASEAN, which it is, or China. And so Malaysia was going to get 2005, and Beijing was going to get 2006. And that really alarmed ASEAN states trying to maintain ASEAN centrality as a buttress against Chinese strategic influence. And it really propelled forward a number of things, our strategic framework with Singapore, but also the Pham Van Khai visit. There was a real urgency to this from Hanoi's perspective. And from the US perspective as well, we saw, and I think this continued through the next administration, the importance of strengthening relationships. Asia, in my view, is moving not towards a Sino-centric system, not towards a US-China bipolar condominium, but really towards some mix of American leadership, competition with China. But the new and most interesting dimension is what theorists would call multipolarity, the dynamic role being played by Vietnam, by Korea, by Indonesia, India, of course, Japan. And strengthening relations with Vietnam would be part of how the US would maintain a favorable balance of power and influence. Very evocative of Richard Nixon's argument in 1967 in Foreign Affairs. He wrote an article, Asia After Vietnam, where he argued to maintain the balance of power after we pulled out of Vietnam, we had to start building relations with India, Japan, Indonesia. He even said China in 1967. It's a similar kind of thinking we're in today. How do we strengthen relationships to have a more favorable balance of power and influence so that China doesn't think it can dominate the region, set the rules? So that was the motivating influence on our side. The complication we had was that Vietnam was on a watch list for religious freedom. And the Congress created a position in the State Department, the Ambassador for Religious Freedom, who reports to the Congress on religious freedom around the world, and Vietnam had a bad score. And in particular because house churches in the Central Highlands were being closed, and Catholic priests, and teachers in parochial schools were being arrested. So this was a real, a contradiction. I raise it because I think we're in a much better place in many ways, but these issues will also be a pace setter for U.S.-Vietnam relations. I was sent to Hanoi in February, right before Tet, early February 2005, and a lot of my counterparts in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the party delayed their vacation to meet with me, and we went through how we would make progress on the security issues, on intelligence sharing for the first time, moving towards a trade agreement, not yet TPP. It would eventually be multilateralized in TPP. And the Vietnamese side opened house churches and released priests. And the visit of Pham Phong Khai was a really good visit. And then, having shown this card to Beijing, the Troika in Hanoi didn't call us. They didn't want ship visits. They started closing house churches a little bit. There was a kind of a recalibration back to open up, to restore some balance with China. There are socialist fraternal ties, more trade with China than the U.S., even though FDI and consumer demand on the U.S. side is more important. But there was a recalibration towards Beijing. And we did not make much progress after that. Then there was a recalibration back to the U.S. by about the time Evan came in. So one of the things I think that has characterized U.S.-Vietnam cooperation in this period is that within Hanoi, this calibration within the leadership, it means there's a certain rhythm to our relations, where we move forward and then things slow down. We move forward, they slow down. We also bear responsibility on the U.S. side, significant responsibility for complicating the relationship by pulling out of TPP, clearly. And so we also have done things that have made this difficult. But I do think, in closing, that the trajectory we're on, which was built on in the Obama administration, is going to continue. That the domestic problems within the US and Vietnam are considerably less. That the structural pressure of China, the weakness of ASEAN and ASEAN centrality, are all going to mean that realists, countries that focus on power, are going to be cooperating more. That means the US and Vietnam, not abandoning ASEAN centrality, but thinking about how to maintain a balance of power. And all of that logic will move us forward, complemented and reinforced by Vietnam's very important growing relationship with Japan through maritime domain awareness and Coast Guard type capacity building. Korea, especially the enormous, I met the head of Samsung in Seoul, and he was, J.Y. Lee, he was incredibly knowledgeable about Vietnam's geography. So the southbound policy by Korea, more shift of production networks, India on strategic issues and energy, Australia. So, other poles in this multipolarity are going to reinforce U.S.-Vietnam cooperation because our most important allies consider Vietnam one of their most important partners. So I'm quite bullish on the relationship, but the little history I recounted shows you some of these issues, the progress in democracy, U.S. trade policy, how Vietnam calibrates with China to maintain its internal ideological balance, its regional balance. All these things are going to be pace setters that are complicating for us. Evan?
Great. Thank you, Mike. Well, and thank you to Amy and the ambassador for inviting me here today. My experience of Vietnam from the NSC perch was very similar to Mike's in the sense of, as somebody who's not a Vietnam expert, but was responsible from the NSC for managing this relationship, what I found was a relationship with enormous potential. But the question was, how do you tap that potential in a way that is mutually advantageous? And what we found in the Obama administration, more in the second term than in the first term, was that there was a lot of opportunity to turn this potential into actuality. But it required a baseline set of strategic understandings between the two capitals in order to do that. And I would say that there were at least three basic ideas at the heart of the US-Vietnam relationship that allowed, under the Obama administration, for a trajectory that was uniquely both positive and linear. It's not that often that you find relationships in Asia sort of, if you chart their trajectory over time, they look like that. Now, sometimes it's more steep, sometimes it's less steep, but to have both a positive and linear trajectory is actually a relatively rare thing in diplomacy. And I think it was built on a core set of strategic understandings that were both implicit and explicit. First, in the Obama administration, we understood that the economic dimension of the relationship needed to lead, and it needed to have, and it had to lead in a way that had a inherently strategic dimension to it. So to make a very obvious point that others have made, including in the previous panel, that manifested in TPP. And as Ambassador Scheer very eloquently pointed out, the Vietnamese immediately understood the strategic logic far before many Americans understood the strategic logic of it. And it's no coincidence then that you had a country like Vietnam that made some very difficult, very costly changes to sort of fit into the very narrow box of TPP. And I give them enormous credit, the leadership enormous credit for sticking with it and sticking with CPTPP. So the economic dimension was important. Number two was, I would say this was more of an implicit understanding than explicit, but sort of delinking the US-Vietnam relationship from the US-China relationship. In other words, the ambassador and I spoke about this multiple times, both when we were working together formally, but also since I've left government. The choice that America presented to Vietnam was the choice not to choose. In other words, we never put it to Vietnam. We never wanted Vietnam to be in a position of having to choose between the United States and China. We saw, as Mike pointed out, that there was sort of a broad correlation between Vietnam-China relations and US-China relations. And we wanted to sort of break that link because we wanted the US-Vietnam relationship to be about our interests and their interests. And of course, we understand historically, theoretically, and very practically the role that China plays in both the US-China relationship, but also the Vietnam-China relationship. But we didn't want that to be a driving force or driving constraint. And I think the sort of the freedom not to choose and never putting our partner in that position opened up, I think, for the leadership in Vietnam, a whole different set of opportunities in the Vietnam relationship. And I saw this most practically. I remember when President Sang in July of 2013 came to Washington and signed the comprehensive partnership. So for those of us in Washington, we're sort of jaded by these things: comprehensive partnership, strategic comprehensive partnership. But at the time, what we knew was that there had been at least 2 or 3 different Politburo sessions within Vietnam debating about whether or not it was appropriate and timely for Vietnam to sign a comprehensive partnership. In other words, this was a difficult, this was a internally controversial decision on the part of the Vietnamese leadership to do this. And I think it was only because of these implicit and explicit understandings that sort of opened up this space that produced, of course, at first the comprehensive partnership, but then all the other practical steps that flowed from that going forward, which was ultimately signing TPP, the decisions that allowed us to partially lift the arms embargo and then completely lift the arms embargo, and then importantly, the General Secretary Chum's visit to Washington in June of 2015, the first ever, which was a very deliberate strategic signal on the part of the United States about President Obama's views about the potential for this relationship. I would say the third strategic understanding was sort of Vietnam's role within the Asia-Pacific, and in particular, a point that Mike and I talked about, which was sort of the multilateral dimension of the US-Vietnam relationship. And that it wasn't just about working with the United States, but that perhaps there were other like-minded partners that shared vision for a rules-based order. And so that was Japan and Australia. And so subsequently, since 2013, what we've seen is not just a growth of the US-Vietnam relationship, but a corresponding expansion of Australia-Vietnam ties, Vietnam-Indian ties, and also Vietnam-Japan ties. And again, it's both about those bilateral relationships, but also about reinforcing dimensions of that rules-based order that create a strategic environment in the Asia-Pacific where countries don't have to make uncomfortable and difficult choices. So the last point I'll make is, since 2016, I think the strategic environment for Vietnam has gotten a lot more difficult. Amy asked us to talk a little bit about Vietnam in the Asia-Pacific, taking it away from the bilateral context for a minute. And I think it's simply gotten a lot more difficult for the Vietnamese because the regional and global context had changed. Point number one, Trump's America First foreign policy. The practical reality is the withdrawal from TPP, the criticizing of traditional alliances, the fact that the U.S. at best looks uncertain, at worst looks unpredictable and unreliable. That's very difficult for a country like Vietnam that made big strategic bets under the Bush administration and the Obama administration. And the question is, have those bets really paid off? And I understand the ambassador probably won't want to comment on this, but when you have a big partner that you've made politically controversial decisions look unpredictable and unreliable, that's complicated. That's problematic. Point number two, I think in the current international environment, international institutions are struggling, whether it's the European Union or the UN Security Council or ASEAN. It's very clear that institutions are having a hard time keeping up with the sort of myriad of both domestic and international challenges facing them. And I think, as Mike rightly pointed out, ASEAN is far from immune from these challenges because ASEAN is having a difficult time maintaining cohesion and meeting a whole variety of regional challenges. I give the region credit for transitioning from TPP to CPTPP, but I think ASEAN had very, very little to do with that. And there's a lot of debate and discussion about what ASEAN's role is going to be. Look no further than this sort of the acid test of the South China Sea issue. ASEAN is unfortunately, while it has at least maintained its cohesion amid the challenges of the South China Sea, it's not played a very significant role in defending the sovereignty interests of the relevant claimants. And so I think the weakness of international institutions presents a real problem, especially for a country like Vietnam that really stuck its head out, was sort of leading the charge sort of in lockstep with the Philippines, and that strategy hasn't worked particularly well. I think the third change in the global and regional context has been the rise of populism and nationalism more globally than in the Asia-Pacific, but there are attributes in the Asia-Pacific. I mean, if I'm in Vietnam's position, in 2016, there were two very consequential populist elections that radically changed Vietnam's strategic reality. The first is the election of President Trump and his pursuit of an America First foreign policy. And the second was the election of Duterte in the Philippines, which clearly was populist in orientation. And I don't think it had anything to do with China or Duterte's pro-China views, but the practical result was it fundamentally changed the ASEAN dynamics, and the Philippines receded as being a partner in pushing China on South China Sea issues, put Vietnam very uncomfortably and exclusively out front that forced Vietnam to recalibrate. So populism and nationalism as both global and regional forces had a huge effect on Vietnam. And then lastly, populism and nationalism has been at part at the root of this sort of rise of protectionist sentiments globally. And for an export-oriented economy like Vietnam, the sort of international trade environment has a whole variety of headwinds. All you have to do is open up the FT today. The WTO put out its annual assessment of of global demand and whether or not that was going to drive trade. And it's not a particularly positive story. And so it's not just about TPP and CPTPP, it's whether or not countries are in the mood of sort of erecting barriers to foreign exports. And if you're Vietnam, one of the biggest drivers of economic growth is going to face a very complicated environment looking out in the future. And so I think that despite the fact that there's been a lot of inherent momentum and there's a lot of latent potential in the U.S.-Vietnam relationship, I think Mike and I are in very strong agreement. From Vietnam's perspective, its geopolitical environment, both globally and regionally, faces a whole slew of headwinds, both those related and unrelated to the United States. And I think that's going to challenge the bilateral relationship to achieve its full potential. Thank you.
Thank you. So let me begin the discussion by turning to Ambassador Ngoc and asking you, Mr. Ambassador, if you have any comments or reactions to the views that were just put forward by Mike and Evan.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. M.B.C. Wright. I'm very honored to have two professors from Georgetown University. In Vietnam, we say Georgetown University Mafia. So I want to be your student in the near future.
Can we give you a grade?
Sure.
And he's Don Corleone.
Thank you. And by the way, when you pronounce the word Vietnam, you should be very careful. I think Ambassador Shir knows very well. Nam is spring roll, right? It's very tasty food in Vietnam, which become worldwide. Nam figurative meaning is girlfriend.
Yeah.
So we should be very careful with that.
Now I know why she threw it.
And thank you, both Dr. Green and Dr. Medeiros for providing us a very brief but very comprehensive picture of U.S.-Vietnam relations. I just want to add 3 points. First, for the last 24 years, I think both our two countries have gone a long way from former foes to friends and then become partners. And many of us could not imagine at the beginning of this process, how could we evolve that kind of relationship to the level we have now? Second, I can briefly tell you about the 3 stages in the bilateral relations. The first one was the normalization in 1995, and it was a great turning point in the history of our two countries. Like Dr. Medeiros talked about the discussion among ourselves on the following stages, but at the very beginning, it was a big discussion. You know already about the past. So I think the decision of our leaders on both sides to normalize relations is a historic one. And we want to appreciate the strong leadership and also the great contribution from so many people from both sides. I can mention some of them. Senator John McCain, former Secretary John Kerry, and in Vietnam, the kids call them 2 Uncle Johns. They are so well known in Vietnam. Former Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel, many others. The second stage marked by the comprehensive partnership in 2013. And as Dr. Medeiros said, that it was also a very important decision. And I want to emphasize that the process from normalization to comprehensive partnership is also a journey of building trust, which is not easy at all. I think Ambassador Shir was in Vietnam for 4 years, so he met with all folks of life, from the government officials to ordinary people, veterans, and even victims of the war. So from the bitter past, we changed the bad to good. We turn foes to friends and become partners. I think it's really historical changes in the bilateral relations. And I think Many of us here, Ambassador Scheer, Dr. Medeiros, Dr. Green, and I think Dr. Amy Searice, many others, can be proud of the achievements we got so far. And the third stage, I think, marked by the very recent event, the second summit by Chairman Kim and President Trump in Hanoi. Mm-hmm. And it shows the level of cooperation between Vietnam and the United States. And as Dr. Surai mentioned in the first panel, Vietnam already appeared on the international diplomatic stage. And it also showed the substance of cooperation between Vietnam and the United States, which goes beyond the bilateral issues and expand to regional and global issues. So my third point is I share the view of Dr. Green and Dr. Medeiros that there are a lot of rooms for further development, which they have great potential for cooperation. But at the same time, we also maintain good relationship with China, because we have been living with China for 4,000 or 5,000 years, and we want to have constructive, stable, friendly relationship with China. And many other key players in the region, like Japan, India, Republic of Korea, Australia, etc., many other countries. So I think with the United States, I think that Dr. Medeiros talked about comprehensive, strategic, or strategic comprehensive partnership. You may ask me some question about it later, but I think the name is not important. The substance of cooperation is more important. And if we look back to the history of our relations, I think we can be proud of what we achieved so far.
Thank you. Well, those were three really excellent set of remarks. So let me begin the discussion by, I guess, summarizing a little bit of what I heard you say, with perhaps adding a couple of points and asking for your reactions. It seems that the arguments that Dr. Green and Dr. Medeiros made were very much about how strategically important Vietnam is, and it's justified the really intense investment of time and energy, diplomatic energy and engagement with Vietnam. And some of the reasons why Vietnam has been so important is that there's shared strategic concerns, especially in the maritime domain, and concerns about Chinese assertiveness and the need to respect the rule of law. Second, Vietnam really punches above its weight diplomatically. It thinks very strategically, and it's willing to put skin in the game in terms of really standing up for its interests and its strategic vision. And then third, Vietnam is a member of ASEAN, and as we often look at ASEAN with concern about ASEAN unity, and we look at countries like Cambodia and Laos that in many ways are the weak link of ASEAN and often prevent unity and ASEAN consensus, Vietnam, especially at a time when the Philippines has receded somewhat in terms of its expression of its interests within ASEAN, Vietnam has become a real voice within ASEAN to hold the line against allowing China to divide and conquer. So in the code of conduct negotiations that are ongoing between China and ASEAN, and the concerns that have been raised about some of the components that are in some of the drafts that have been circulating around, we can look at a country like Vietnam with some confidence that Vietnam would not let ASEAN agree to a really weak position on maritime rights and cooperation with external partners and that sort of thing. So I guess the question I have for any of you is, do I have that characterization right, or am I leaving some important things out? And is this enough? Is this going to be sufficient to continue to justify this very high level of engagement? I mean, after all, we've talked already today about how many presidential visits there have been between President Obama and President Trump to Vietnam, and hosting high-level visits here. Secretary Mattis met with his Vietnam counterpart, possibly more than any other counterpart. He met with him very frequently, the way Ash Carter met with his Indian counterpart so frequently. And as we've been talking about all of the constraints on rapidly expanding our defense cooperation and strategic cooperation because of Vietnam's comfort level, and as we've talked about the economic side of the relationship, taking a step back with the United States withdrawal from TPP and some trade frictions that now have sort of taken its place. Should we remain confident that not just the Trump administration, but ongoing administrations will continue to see the rationale for investing so heavily in the relationship? Does anyone have any?
Well, I think the forces you described, that was a pretty good summary with some extra special sauce to move the discussion even further forward. I think the forces or the winds behind the relationship are, as you described, generally positive. The geopolitical logic of the U.S. and Vietnam working to ensure that the region has a strategic equilibrium that is more about continuity than sudden change because of China's rising power is very compelling. But you have to open that up a little bit. What does that mean? Does it mean that the U.S. and Vietnam are moving towards the kind of security relationship that would involve a mutual security treaty or significantly more purchases by Vietnam of U.S. military aircraft or submarines? Probably not. I think for the strategic reasons Vietnam's always been fiercely independent, it will be much more likely to diversify its playbook well beyond the U.S. So that means the U.S. approach needs to take into account how do we look at this relationship in terms of Vietnam's capacity, resilience, strength to resist coercion, and how do we look at the supply of those capabilities or that capacity, not just in a bilateral context, but thinking about Japan, Korea, Australia, India, the Europeans to some extent. Can we then frame that around, can a Quad, U.S., Japan, Australia, and India have a Vietnam strategy? Yes, but it better be pretty quiet, because if four big powers come out and say, here's what we've decided for Vietnam, it's not going to go over well. So it's going to require something we're not very good at, which is nuance and subtlety, but a lot of coordination with other players that share the same vision for Vietnam, having the capacity to resist coercion and resilience. The withdrawal from TPP was a blow, particularly in terms of, I think, Hanoi's confidence in American strategic competence. But in terms of the economic impact, there's so much supply chain movement out of China to Vietnam for other reasons that the actual economic effect anticipated by TPP is happening. And so I think there's going to be a lot of strategic interest in Korea, Japan, U.S., in Vietnam for economic reasons. The third leg of U.S. foreign policy, always security, economics. The third leg is always, values, democracy. I don't think that will upend or block the relationship, but it does require some tending to. I think there are many dimensions to this. You mentioned rule of law, where in Vietnam there's very keen interest in strengthening rule of law and so forth. But there's going to have to be a dimension of religious freedom and democracy promotion, even if it is incremental, because there are important constituencies for that in the U.S. Congress. In general, we've, for the past, I think, through the Bush and Obama administrations, moved these things forward subtly. We had a successful visit with Pham Van Khai and addressed some issues which were pretty important to President Bush, who was particularly focused on religious freedom. I think the Obama administration was able to use TPP as a framework to get some important movements forward on labor. So it's not a transformational, revolutionary thing. There needs to be a sense that we're working together on these, in not to break the relationship. I think that President Trump has not, well, first of all, he has not emphasized human rights, religion, democracy, any of that stuff. And we're not in TPP, so it's not clear to me what the administration's framework will be to keep some appropriate, I don't want to overstate it, but appropriate attention to what I would say is helping Vietnam be a more resilient state in terms of its institutions. So that is not a showstopper, but that's one area where I think you don't want to have a kind of administration policy that never talks about this, and then a congressional policy that raises it as an obstacle. Because we've managed to avoid that through 2 administrations. And it's not happening now, but I would keep an eye on that over the horizon.
I very much agree with Mike that, in essence, the drivers in the relationship exceed the constraints on the relationship, and that looks like those conditions will persist for at least the next 5 to 10 years, certainly through the next administration. I think that the challenges the relationship face are the following. Number one is that we've simply done so much so fast that the progress trajectory will probably start to flatten out at some point, because a lot of the big pieces of business have been done. And so, as Mike rightly pointed out, it's about sort of digesting them and seeing how much the relationship can sort of absorb of all the work that's been done. I mean, for example, under the Obama administration, one of the last things we did was get the Peace Corps into Vietnam. And it takes time for programs like that to really develop. Of course, we lifted the arms embargo. I think on the US side, there's not much more that can be done until you can see some actual practical behavior of Vietnam taking advantage of that strategic step on the part of the United States. So as we move into a phase of the progress curve flattening out, the question will be how well does the relationship do digesting its progress? And then to Mike's point, there's going to need to be consistent progress on questions of not only freedom of religion, but also freedom of speech, assembly, access to information. Given the role that Congress plays in this relationship, there's going to be, the U.S. will need to see consistent work on that. And I worry that because the Trump administration clearly doesn't prioritize these particular issues, it might reset expectations in Hanoi in an inaccurately sort of low way. And these are issues that matter to American society, to our legislative leaders, and they need to sort of remain there. And if the U.S.-Vietnam relationship is going to maintain a strategic consensus that this is not all about balancing Chinese power, that there's more there, a key dimension to maintaining that strategic consensus is making sure that work on these human rights types of issues continues in a consistent way. And so I think when the President/General Secretary comes to visit, I think Americans will want to know and hear from him his sort of views on those particular issues.
I share many comments of Dr. Green and Dr. Medeiros. I think the areas of common interest between the United States and Vietnam are very, very large. And then I can name here some of them. First and foremost, the joint efforts to maintain peace, stability, security, and cooperation in the whole Indo-Pacific region. I think that's the long-term requirement. And it also lays the foundation for our further cooperation. Second, I think the order in the region based on the rule, international law, and also to ensure the freedom of navigation and aviation. And third, you also mentioned about the role of ASEAN, especially ASEAN centrality in the emerging architecture in this region. So I think ASEAN as a whole, and particularly Vietnam with the United States, we have a lot of things to work together to consolidate the solidarity, the unity of ASEAN, the independent ASEAN, which is still open for good relationship with our outside major powers. And I think the fourth area I just mentioned, the denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula, and like two doctors mentioned earlier, we are waiting for the United States to return to CPTPP in the near future. So many strategic.
So are we.
You talk about the constraints. I just want to highlight the human rights and democracy issue. I think this is the area we have different views, but we agree to talks. Right. And so far, I think we have 25 round of talks every year. And we put everything on the tables for discussion. And I think if you look at the process, you will see the progress from the legal framework, from the constitution to the lower level laws and regulations. And of course, we share the same goal to ensure the human rights and democracy for our people. But of course, we are of different social, political, and also economic development, and also historical background. So we still have different approach. But I think the most important point here is to continue the dialogue and try to manage this issue so that it will not prevent us from further cooperation, but it helps us, to consolidate the trust, the cooperation, and also to help our two peoples to understand each other.
I think you're right that the openness to discussion on human rights is really important, and the human rights dialogue that we've held annually has been a very important mechanism. Let me just pick up on a different thread that both Mike and the ambassador have mentioned, which is Vietnam's working with other partners in the region. We at a time where we are talking a lot about the Quad, and there's trilateral frameworks with U.S., Japan, Australia, U.S., Japan, Korea. It seems to me that one underappreciated relationship that Vietnam has is with India. And there's a lot of military security cooperation, in part because, as we discussed in the earlier panel, Vietnam has long had close ties to Russia and has bought a lot of Russian arms and equipment, as does India have that kind of relationship with Russia and Russia arms. So they have some shared platforms and some areas and submarine cooperation and other areas that they work together. And it seems that if there is more work to be done to work with Vietnam in the Indian Ocean region, this would be an area that we might really want to think about a trilateral discussion for security and other kinds of cooperation between these countries. I don't know if anyone has any thoughts on that, or if there were any attempts to kind of initiate some discussions along those lines in either of your administrations, Mike and Evan.
I mean, I would say in the Obama administration, the discussions were more with partners in the region about their relationships with Vietnam and the direction of them, and how sort of those initiatives could collectively build or sort of support this rules-based order on both security issues and economic issues. I think it's sort of difficult to sort of show up in Hanoi and say, hey, we've got this big grand strategy for the region to box out the Chinese, and here's the role that you're going to play. That's not really how the relationship works, and I don't think that particular approach would be welcome in Hanoi. So I think it's sort of, while the approach is there, how you actually sort of go about and build it in a way that is coherent, I think is sort of a little bit challenging. I don't know, Mike, what was your experience?
I like trilats. I've actually started or been involved with a lot of them. I suspect that Hanoi would be a little careful about a formal or public trilateral security dialogue with the U.S. and Japan or U.S. and Australia, because these always get Beijing's attention, and Beijing always démarches, squeezes the smaller parties. So we were doing a lot of trilaterals when I was in the White House, and we've done them at CSIS, and it's never the Americans who are approached by the Chinese side saying, what are you doing? It's always the Australians or the New Zealanders or the Canadians or whoever. It's the smaller parties. And so I suspect that Hanoi would be a little cautious about that, because Vietnam's very careful about what it puts on the scale with China, and chooses judiciously where it needs to draw a line. And that would not be something I suspect that they would want to draw the line on, unless China pushed Vietnam to the point in the Spratlys or Parasols, or in the South China Sea, where the Hanoi wanted to show that it was getting pissed off to the point where it was going to talk to other big powers about what China's doing. These trilaterals are very much like that. There's strategic signaling in them. The other thing they do is sometimes actual coordination on issues where the respective U.S. bilateral alliances need to connect. So the best example is U.S., Japan, Korea, which is not functioning well now, but U.S., Japan, Korea is really critical because we have very joint and combined command with Korea. U.S. forces Japan in the rear area support role, there's a lot of operational questions, intelligence sharing that just practically has to happen. And then sometimes you do trilaterals to compare strategic notes. And in that case, the U.S.-Japan, a U.S.-Japan-Vietnam, U.S.-Australia-Vietnam would be quite useful, but probably quiet would be my thinking. What Evan said is something I think the U.S. needs to find a way to institutionalize or make more regular, which is talking to other partners about their relations with Vietnam or with other countries. And, I would imagine that people in the National Security Council, the Pentagon, should have a very clear map of which countries on China's periphery are getting coerced and how. And then talk to other, the big allies like Japan, powers like India, about what others are seeing in that respect and what everybody's doing to help.
And
we do that. You do that. I suspect to some extent the Trump administration does that. It tends to be ad hoc. It tends to go into depending on the principal who's meeting and what else is crowding out the agenda. My sense is we need a much more deliberate mapping of Chinese
we
coercion.
did a little of that in the Obama administration. We had an initiative where basically Americans, Japanese, and Australians got together to talk about their strategies for maritime domain awareness and coordinate a little bit about who's going to provide what to whom, whether it's Vietnam or Malaysia or Indonesia, et cetera. But to your point, it was much more ad hoc and episodic than it was sort of consistent and broad-ranging. So I agree, that's an area where we could do a lot more. It's hard because the U.S., I know this is going to sound like a silly point, but it's hard because the U.S. government is so big, and even when you're the senior director for Asia at the NSC, is as much as you think you can sort of reach down and touch anybody, it's a lot harder than that. Everybody sort of has their own agendas and their own sort of capabilities. It's a lot more difficult to coordinate that.
Really? I just commanded and they obeyed. Right, Dave?
Let me ask about regional architecture. Vietnam is going to chair ASEAN next year. Both you, Mike, and Evan have had experience with these high-level meetings, presidential meetings, at the East Asia Summit, and Vietnam will also, as I mentioned earlier today, be hosting the 10th anniversary of the ADMM+. So it's also a time when ASEAN is doing some thinking on its own about its own Indo-Pacific view or concept. I think they're still deciding on what noun to use, framework, but they're coming up with an Indo-Pacific vision of some sort that they will likely create consensus around and look to bring to the East Asia Summit sort of agenda. And there's some good components that are being discussed in this new Indo-Pacific vision for ASEAN that include things like international law and good governance, rule of law. But there's also a heavy emphasis on development, sustainable development and meeting development goals, which if really brought to the East Asia Summit might pull the East Asia Summit a little bit away potentially from some of the more strategic issues. So what advice would you have for Vietnam as it looks to shape up its year as chair of ASEAN?
Amy, can I start?
Yes, please.
So my experience at the NSC was that when we approached the the sort of trifecta of APEC, ASEAN, and EAS, though of course it's really EAS and the ASEAN meetings that matter, that the agendas that the region worked on, they were almost always inherently defensive in nature. Or to put it differently, on the issues that really mattered, it was inherently defensive. And that I always found incredibly frustrating. The chairs of ASEAN were always trying to make sure, a variety of things that had happened in the past didn't happen again, as opposed to articulating a positive vision to push the organization to do new and different things, to use this very unique collection of leaders at the East Asia Summit to get real work done. And, so if I were king for a day, I would encourage my friends in Vietnam to have that sort of proactive vision for EAS and and the various ASEAN summits. And that, and that really begins in 2019. In other words, begin to put the building blocks in place so we see a sequence of events that begin with the ASEAN foreign ministers meetings that I believe are in the first quarter of 2020, move toward the ARF, which is always in the summer, July, August, and then culminate in the East Asia Summit meeting. In other words, so there is a full 12-month game plan for getting things done, and that getting things done can't be preventing the Chinese from stopping the signing of a joint statement, right? It has to be, it can't be just maintaining ASEAN consensus. It has to be putting forward a very proactive agenda on things that matter, and the things that matter can't be more work on transnational security issues, right? It has to be things that will affect, as a phrase Mike likes to use, the sort of distribution of relative capabilities throughout the region. And that's an area where I hope that the United States and Vietnam are already having conversations. Because I think if Mike or I were in the White House, we would absolutely be in Hanoi having these conversations about what 2020 is going to look like, and then build a very systematic game plan that begins in the first quarter of 2020 that culminates in the EAS.
Great. Anything to add, Mike?
I agree with that, and I think it's interesting that ASEAN and Vietnam is pushing this, are putting forward an Indo-Pacific vision. To me, it's further evidence that the administration's free and open Indo-Pacific strategic vision or concept is durable. I mean, it has full of flaws. You've heard them talked about at CSIS, how do you have free and open? We don't have free trade. We don't talk about open societies. We don't have an assistant secretary for the region, things like that. But the basic operating assumption behind this free and open Indo-Pacific vision, and especially the use of the word Indo-Pacific, is that the future of the region is not going to be a U.S.-China condominium. It's not going to be a new model of great power relations. It's going to be a vision where ambitious powers like Japan and Indonesia and India and Vietnam are going to have a big say in the future of the region. And it's not all going to be decided by a U.S.-China condominium like the new model of great power relations. That basic assumption is clearly resonating, even if elements of the U.S. policy are problematic. And you can see that in the Indo-Pacific, because I think that's the view of, that would certainly, I think, be the view of Vietnam, that the Vietnams and Indias and others should have a big say. And that's also very useful for the U.S. or Japan or Australia now. So that's good, I think. It shows some more strategic alignment in general views between Hanoi and Washington. And then Evan's point about getting off defense is really important. And I think as the chair of the ASEAN, the host of the East Asia Summit, Vietnam has a real opportunity to move towards agenda setting again. And not agenda setting, as Evan says, about defining non-traditional security, confidence building mechanism, working groups, and stuff like that, but big strategic issues. And so I think actually infrastructure is strategic, very, very strategic. And the Belt and Road, the Maritime Silk Road, the Digital Belt Road, all of these are, it's complicated, there's a lot behind the Belt Road, but one dimension is the targeting of strategic ports and infrastructure with important security and geopolitical consequences. Another dimension is the effect of debt traps on the sovereignty, resilience of countries. I think the US and Vietnam share an interest in making sure that countries develop infrastructure but don't fall into debt traps, and that there's infrastructure built across the region, but it's not done in a way that would allow in a crisis Chinese companies to turn ports in Vanuatu or Hambantota over to the PLA. That's very destabilizing. And if you have a broad agenda setting strategy in the EAS and other, these never happen in one multilateral summit. You play them out across. It's like Hamilton. You have a Chicago show, you have a New York show, a London show. This is an agenda you want to broaden to APEC and the US, Japan, Australia, Trilateral, and other things. But if you're focused on what the Japanese call quality infrastructure, transparency, fighting or resisting debt traps, that becomes an agenda. And if through ASEAN centrality, Vietnam says this is a priority for us, you know that the U.S. and Canada and Japan and other EAS countries, India, are going to agree with that. And that's a way to go on offense, and it's strategic. And I think it will affect China's debate. I mean, the big second, the Belt and Road Forum, BARF 2 this year, the theme in China is quality infrastructure. That's a Japanese phrase. So it may only be branding, but what the rest of the region does shapes China's approach. And so huge potential, actually, to do what Evan's describing.
Right.
Amy, could I come back on one point? Because I want to build on Mike's very good point about the sort of Indo-Pacific vision statement. So as somebody that negotiated lots of these statements, whether it's U.S.-China joint statements, U.S.-ASEAN statements, EAS, et cetera, there's no question for purposes of strategic signaling, words matter. But here's the unfortunate reality. Only big words really matter. In other words, the region will really not benefit from anything but a big, ambitious vision statement. And unfortunately, I'm skeptical that you're going to get that out of ASEAN, just because of the inherent nature of the institution. I don't know of any U.S.-ASEAN statement or ASEAN statement alone that I would call big, ambitious, and visionary. So I think the vision statement is a good thing. I'm not endorsing it. But here's the reality. A U.S.-ASEAN Indo-Pacific vision statement is not going to move the dial strategically in the region. It's important, and I support it. That's not my point. But rather, you really want to move the dial. It's going to take activity and behavior on the part of these countries in the region. So as great as these vision statements are, and I endorse going forward with it, you either sort of go big or you sort of have to have a lot of behavior associated with it, because the U.S.-ASEAN relationship is just sort of littered with joint statements, chairman statements, vision statements, and they're not going to move the dial as much as actual behavior.
When they move the dial, in my experience, is when they resonate with statements that good diplomacy gets that resonate in the World Bank and IMF, in bilaterals, in transatlantic summits. If you start having certain themes about infrastructure coming up in every international meeting that the Chinese go to, and then you start having a basis for funding that through JBIC or OPIC or DFAT, there's a way to move the dial. But I think if it's just a one-off, U.S.-ASEAN summits, or forget U.S.-ASEAN summits, EASs that are kind of one-offs that don't build on an agenda in other multilateral forums and bilateral relationships and international financial institutions are not so useful.
I mean, Mike makes an interesting point. I mean, when I was thinking of sort of a game plan, I was thinking tied to an Asia strategy. But imagine if you had dimensions of, the U.S., this Indo-Pacific vision that was tied to what was happening at NATO summits or G20 or G7, right? It sort of had a global dimension to it. But as you know, the higher you go in the quality and the controversy of statements, the harder it is to get people to agree to it, because it suddenly starts to look like costly and pointed at those countries that don't like things that are pointed at them.
This is the great thing about having Mike and Evan on the panel. You can just ask a question. They'll just continue the conversation back and forth for a while. I do want to open it up, unless, Ambassador, you have something to add on this as well.
I have 2 points. First one, I would recommend our government to have both doctors as senior advisors for our chair summit in 2020 without pay. Sorry about that. That's okay. And second, I think you are right to mention about the significance to have a game plan and preparation from now. And I think among ASEAN, with the leadership of Indonesia, we have been discussing the Indo-Asia Pacific outlook, as Ambassador Wright just mentioned. And I think we try to find the common ground from different strategies and initiatives. This is very important for ASEAN when we have a common approach. And we hope that in June, at the foreign ministers meeting, we can propose the very first document. And at EAS, we can announce publicly the outlook. basically, we have two pillars. The first one is security, and the second, the development. So we try to balance those two pillars. And we have been discussing with the United States, China, Japan, India, European Union, etc., so that we can build the agenda for 2020. So having you as senior advisors in Hanoi will be a big push for that. But you talk about, Ambassador Dr. Medeiros talk about the big ambitious vision for ASEAN. I think the ASEAN approach is incremental, step by step. And we try to form the sustainable, stable, and long-term framework. So it may be different from the American way. So this is ASEAN way, so we try to accommodate. Thank you.
Okay, we only have 5 minutes left, so maybe time for 2 questions. I think I'll take 2 questions together and then just ask our panelists to respond to anything they want. Murray and then Marvin.
Thanks. Very fascinating discussion. I just wanted to add, Mike, you know, when Fan Mun Kai dinner happened at the Mayflower, I presume you were there, and somebody did not shake a cane at you, but actually somebody threw red wine all over John McCain's white.
Actually, I think they missed John McCain and hit Matt, as I recall.
Matt Daley?
Matt Daley, I think, hit the
So
right.
I just, you
Secret
sort
Service instincts.
You sort of started to answer this, but taking off on Evan's idea of being king for a day, I'm wanting to look ahead to the possible visit by the president, party secretary later, and push you a little harder on this. Mike, you said there's all kinds of headwinds on trade and things. Evan said we've done the easy stuff, but you know the president, party secretary doesn't want to fly across 8,000 miles and come here and just have lunch with the president and leave. So what, and we've also lost Secretary Mattis, who was very strategic on this. So in that context, I'm sorry to push you hard, but your successor in the White House in the NSC asked you to come and tell him give suggestions. What would you tell him? Thank you.
Okay, let's go right to another question. Marvin.
Yeah, just real quick, I've always been intrigued with the potential in a relationship between Vietnam and Indonesia. And I wonder if there are any thoughts on the panel.
Okay, and I'll go to one quick third question up here. Sorry, one more question up here. This gentleman, could you briefly introduce yourself and ask your question?
My name. Is this on? Yes. My name is David Burnell. I've had the privilege of living in Hanoi 11 out of the last 19 years, starting in 2000 when there were 3 traffic lights there, and directing the critical mass of the U.S. aid, technical economic governance assistance across many sectors of Vietnam, economic transformation, and so that's the background. There are 2 countervailing forces that haven't been really mentioned today that I'd like to mention that are operating under the geostrategic political radar. One is, we talked about the supply chain moving from China to Vietnam. The largest amount of money in that supply chain and aimed at infrastructure, productive enterprises, real estate, tourism is coming from China into Vietnam. So the investment in this new supply chain is essentially China financed in terms of private sector-ish money and business initiative. Just a fact. The second thing is, on the very positive side, the relationship citizen to citizen, people to people, Vietnam and the U.S., is exponentially expanding in the most positive sense of the word over the last couple of generations. The Fulbright program relationship, I think, is in its 26th or 7th year now. But this is a powerful under-the-surface force in the 2 countries that's affecting things, or it's an asset that keeps on giving and it's going to exponentially expand. The hidden X factor in that is when it comes right down to it, these same people will finally share that when the reservoir doubt they feel about whether when push comes to crunch, the U.S. will stand behind its words and its expressed intent about this relationship. If it weren't for the China X factors, the sky would be unlimited between these two countries. Recognizing that this is this is very subtle and critical stuff, how do you see these kinds of factors affecting how to work the future?
Okay, so 3 questions. I'll let the panelists respond to any one of them or anything you'd like to say. We're over time, so you can each have just 2 or 3 minutes.
In this order?
In this order.
Sure.
Start with Mike.
So Vietnam-Indonesia relations within ASEAN, I mean, Indonesia should be the brawn of ASEAN. Singapore, we think of as the brain. But the only country in ASEAN that has kind of a mix of brain and brawn is probably Vietnam, which is why there's so much, not as much brawn maybe as Indonesia, I don't know about as much brain as Singapore, but a pretty impressive mix of both brain and brawn. So as an agenda center within ASEAN, I think that's one of the reasons that so many people in Washington have a focus on Vietnam. And Indonesia, as you know, Marvin, its strategic culture is changing, and I think there is more focus in Jakarta on these geopolitical issues, even with Jokowi himself not particularly interested. And I don't know the answer exactly, but I would suspect that's rich, fertile territory for Vietnam to start building some backbone into ASEAN, which really lost credibility in this town in July 2016 when the consensus statement on the tribunal ruling was broken through certain small countries that were paid large amounts of money. And the people-to-people point's really, really important. As you were speaking, sir, I was thinking of Stephanie Murphy, a Democratic member of Congress from Florida, Vietnamese American, incredibly important voice on U.S.-Asia relations right now in the Congress. So the diaspora, if you will, has always been important. If you go through the halls of the State Department, as Dave would know, the Korea desk, the Japan desk, Asia-Pacific Americans are part of our diplomatic toolkit, and you can see it happening in the State Department and in Congress and elsewhere. But also, just as a professor at Georgetown, there's been a surge in quantity, but especially quality of students from Vietnam who are some of them are here, I don't want to embarrass them, but are just crushing it. So in a way that will provide real leadership in the relationship. It's a very important, exciting point. I see it more with U.S.-Vietnam than any other relationship in Asia right now, to be honest, speaking as a professor. Party Secretary General, man, that's a hard question, and we're out of time. So,
so Evan can answer.
I think, frankly, for this visit, there's going to have to be some small ball. But building around the BUILD Act and infrastructure, for example, looking for capacity building opportunities. But I suspect it'll be a package of smaller things.
Yeah. So first, very much agree on the people-to-people point. We're sort of out of time, so it doesn't allow me to be as articulate as Mike was. But as somebody that's been responsible for managing a variety of relationships, it's difficult to sort of underscore the value that dimension of a relationship plays in building sort of a long-term, sustainable, resilient bilateral relationship. And I see the potential on the U.S.-Vietnam side as very significant. Of course, there's sort of a diaspora community, especially in Southern California, who have a lot of concerns that need to be addressed. I know the ambassador is deeply aware of that. That's a constraint, but hopefully that can be addressed. Marvin, I don't know anything about Indonesia-Vietnam relations. I agree with Mike. Sounds like a good idea, but I haven't seen anything coming out of Jakarta or Jokowi that suggests he's sort of remotely interested in sort of strategically oriented ideas like that. Murray, on what should the General Secretary do? My response, I know, is going to generate a huge chuckle from everybody, but my aspiration would be he would come and have a strategic discussion with President Trump. right? We're at that point in the relationship, and I know the General Secretary well enough to know he's certainly capable of talking about, here's where I see my country going over the next 10 to 25 years, and here's where it needs to connect with the United States, right? Because we're at the arc, that positive arc of the relationship, where you really need to begin to have a strategic dialogue that can only occur at the very top. The question is the United States interested in or capable? I agree with Mike, there's no sort of big ticket items, but just because the big hard things have been done. So my point was not the easy things have been done, but the big pieces of fruit have been plucked from the trees so far. So we're at that point where we need to sort of think about strategic alignment over the long term. And again, I don't mean an alliance or anything like that, right? But I think we need to, if we're going to sort of really sustain this momentum, the leaderships at the top need to have an idea of where we're going. And that's what I would do with this particular trip.
Ambassador, I don't want to take too much time away for your remarks, so if you had a quick comment or two.
Just very brief comments, yeah. I think with Indonesia, when you look at ASEAN as a family, we think Indonesia is our elder brother. But as equal state of sovereignty, we work very closely with Indonesia on many major issues. For example, the Asia Indo-Pacific outlook. We work very closely with Indonesia on this issue. The second question about people to people, I do agree with our two doctors here. I just want to emphasize that the reconciliation among the Vietnamese inside our country and the Vietnamese abroad, including in the United States, is a very, very important task. And that's also one of my priorities. And the last one about the General Secretary, I think I completely agree with Dr. Menderos that the two leaders, Vietnam and the United States, will discuss the vision for the next 25 years. How we can work together for the overall goals of this region, which is changing very fast.
Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking this really terrific group of panelists in the discussion.
Excellent.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we'll ask you guys to leave, and then I'm going to, and we'll go
So
right
I
into
take this
your
out?
remarks. No, yes, take this. Okay, we're going to move right into our final session, which is some remarks by Ambassador Nuck. I've already introduced him. I don't want to take up too much time because we're really running over. But Ambassador Nuck has been ambassador here in the United States since January of last year. He's already made a real mark on the U.S.-Vietnam relationship. He has had a distinguished career in the Vietnamese Foreign Service. And he's no stranger to the United States, having served here, first posted here in San Francisco, a lovely place, in 1997. Prior to coming here, Ambassador Nuck was the Deputy Minister of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in charge of the Americas and especially the United States, as well as international organizations, including the United Nations. So at a time when ASEAN is looking to boost its relationship with the United States, when Vietnam is looking to boost its relationship with the United States and take on the chairmanship of ASEAN and potentially serve in the UN Security Council, Ambassador Nuck is very well placed to be steering these issues. So please join me in welcoming Ambassador Nuck to the stage.
Thank you, Dr. Searight, for your kind introduction. I just want to correct a little bit. I start my term in July. So you cut short my term 6 months. That's dangerous. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, we have just gone through an interesting and productive seminar this morning. We all have enjoyed fruitful and frank discussion, which opens up new opportunities for Vietnam-US cooperation. Especially, there are some impressive ideas to further strengthen our defense and security cooperation, as well as coordination in international and regional issues. We wish to thank CSIS and Dr. Amy Seawright in particular for initiating and hosting this important seminar. I am very delighted to see many of my good friends here today. Dr. Seawright, Evan Medeiros, Ambassador David Shear, and many others. They all have been making great contributions to Vietnam-US relations. I share the comments of Assistant Defense Secretary Shriver, as well as other panelists, on the three following points. First, the US continued commitment and responsible engagement in Indo-Asia-Pacific will help boosting the development and prosperity of each country in the region as well as the whole region. Second, the stable ASEAN-US strategic partnership, as well as the constructive Vietnam-US comprehensive partnership, are essential factors in maintaining peace, stability, security, and cooperation in this region. Third, a strong, independent, and prosperous Vietnam will contribute to fostering ASEAN solidarity, as well as strengthening the joint efforts to build rule-based institutions in Indo-Asia-Pacific in accordance with international laws and respecting national independence, sovereignty, territorial integrity of countries in the regions. Ladies and gentlemen, now I would like to share our perspective on three issues, including overall Vietnam-US relations, defense and security cooperation, and Vietnam-US coordination in regional issues. Vietnam-US comprehensive partnership has witnessed dynamic developments all over 9 pillars, in particular defense, security, and regional cooperation. Political and diplomatic relations are increasingly deepened. Our leaders have frequently exchanged visits and met at international and regional fora. Economic, trade, and investment cooperation continues to be priority, creating solid foundation and big momentum for the overall relations. Bilateral cooperation in culture, education, science, and technology has been enhanced. Expanded people-to-people exchange, we just talked about, helps to increase mutual understanding between our two nations. Together with cooperation in bilateral areas, Vietnam and the United States have been working together to address international and regional issues. These efforts have been contributing to the maintenance of regional peace, stability, security, and cooperation. The two countries are also working together to push forward a free, open, fair economic and trade cooperation in the Indo-Asia-Pacific. Ladies and gentlemen, in the process of building Vietnam-US relations for the past nearly 25 years, defense and security cooperation is one of the highlights of the comprehensive partnership, helping to build mutual trust. Cooperation to address world legacy issues has been one of our most effective joint efforts, which paved the way for our new relationship and put the past behind and look forward to the future. We very much appreciate the U.S. cooperation in dioxin remediation projects, including the completion of remediation in Da Nang Airport in 2017. The two sides have closely worked together in accounting for POW MIA, with nearly 1,000 MIA cases found so far. Our people also thank the U.S. government and non-governmental organizations, as well as the American people, for their support and cooperation in the removal of remnants of UXO, unexplosive ordnance, from the war, and helping many, many victims of the war. The government and people of Vietnam are committed to continued efforts in accounting for American MIAs. Just last week, we had a very fruitful seminar on the world legacy issues, and we had a lot of new initiatives to further promote the cooperation in this area. The two sides are preparing for the launching of dioxin remediation project at Bien Hoa Air Base, which is much larger than the Da Nang Airport project. We look forward to U.S. continued cooperation not only in remediation and removal of UXO, but also in information exchange to account for Vietnamese missing soldiers, as well as helping the victims of the war. Vietnam National Committee of Search and Rescue and Oregon State Defense Force have enjoyed effective cooperation in exercise and information exchange in search and rescue, humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, as Dr. To Anh Tuấn mentioned in his panel. We welcome the U.S. administration to continue the Pacific Partnership and the Pacific Angel initiatives to provide humanitarian assistance and building civilian projects in some disaster-prone areas in Vietnam, especially in the central part. The two countries' air forces have made the first steps of cooperation, including experience exchange, participation in some international Air Force conferences, and military exercise observations. Bilateral military medicine cooperation has been expanded through PEPFAR program, as well as Vietnam, US, Australia Trilateral Cooperation Project on malaria research. Vietnam wishes to enhance cooperation with the United States in aviation, maritime medicine, and surgeon training for Vietnam's PKO forces, research and development in military medical science. Vietnam-US defense and security cooperation not only covers bilateral issues, but also includes coordination in multilateral and regional institutions, including ADMM+, that our panel just discussed, ASEAN-US Defense Ministers Meeting, Shangri-La Dialogue. We very much appreciate the United States as one of the most active and effective partners in assisting Vietnam's PKO deployment process. And we would like to thank the United States for providing equipment for Vietnam's field hospital in South Sudan. We look forward to the U.S. continued support in providing further equipment for our military engineering team and English training for our PKO officers. In the coming time, we need to work closely to implement agreed areas of defense cooperation in the MOU 2011 and Vietnam-US Joint Vision Statement in 2015, as well as the Plan of Action for Defense Cooperation for 2018 and 2020, as Dr. Searipe mentioned earlier, in which priority should be given to addressing war legacy issues, humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, search and rescue, PKO, enhancing maritime law enforcement capabilities. And we need a master plan for effective implementation of defense and security cooperation. Ladies and gentlemen, regarding the cooperation on regional issues, I would like to highlight 5 cooperation areas between the two countries. First, the joint efforts to maintain peace, security, stability, and cooperation. This is the common wish of ASEAN and other regional countries. We appreciate the United States sharing the view of ASEAN, who advocates peaceful resolution to all disputes, and South China Sea, or we call EC, is one of which. Non-use of force, respect for international laws, including UNCLOS 1982 and DOC, as well as respect for independence, sovereignty, territorial integrity of regional countries, and also efforts to ensure freedom of navigation and overflight. Second, on Mekong cooperation, Enhancing the Mekong sub-regional collaboration with other partners is one of the priorities in Vietnam's regional agenda. Today, there are various cooperation mechanisms among Mekong countries as well as between Mekong countries with partners. But we need to further enhance the effectiveness of the existing projects, as well as the coordination among those mechanisms. We believe that the United States could play a role in working with other Mekong partners to avoid the overlapping cooperation among different mechanisms and the waste of resources. At the same time, with the experience, expertise, and potential on IT, the United States could give advice, share information, and support Mekong countries in building the database on water resource security and management. Third, on ASEAN. As a member of ASEAN, Vietnam is very pleased with the progress of ASEAN-US strategic partnership. We very much appreciate the support of the United States for ASEAN as a strong, independent, and united regional organization, and at the same time open to external partners and ready to cooperate with major powers as the United States, China, Japan, etc. ASEAN would like to thank the United States for her continued support for ASEAN centrality in the regional architecture through ASEAN-led forums as EAS, ARF, ADMM+, etc. Fourth, on Korean Peninsula. As a responsible member of the United Nations, Vietnam has strictly been implementing UN Security Council resolution on DPRK. We have been making initial efforts to facilitate the US-North Korea negotiation process with the second summit held in Hanoi recently. With our own experience in the process of normalization of relations with the United States, a step-by-step approach is needed for pushing forward the process of negotiation for denuclearization and peace on the Korean Peninsula. That approach would help the two sides to build trust with each other and form internal consensus in which country, which is also very important. Vietnam is also willing to share with DPRK our experience on the open door and economic development policy and regional integration. Last but not least, on the Indo-Asia Pacific region, I shared the views of Assistant Defense Secretary Shriver on the need to work with other partners, not excluding anyone in implementing the Indo-Asia Pacific vision. Vietnam, as well as ASEAN countries, have a great demand for development cooperation, especially economic cooperation, which will help Vietnam and ASEAN grow stronger, independent, further contributing to the efforts of maintenance of peace, stability, security, and cooperation in the whole region. ASEAN in general and Vietnam in particular hope that the United States will further coordinate with other countries to increase economic cooperation as an important pillar in implementing your regional policy. Due to the fact that the United States does not have ODA, Official Development Aid, we hope that the government of the United States would strengthen the favorable conditions to attract more and more American private sectors to invest in our region. We also expect the United States to work with ASEAN to promote ASEAN Indo-Asia Pacific Outlook, which is under discussion. The cooperation areas proposed by the United States on energy, infrastructure, development and digital economy are much in line with ASEAN priorities. So now let me come to the conclusion. The future of Vietnam-US relations is bright. A stable Vietnam-US comprehensive partnership is an important factor contributing to the maintenance of peace, security, and cooperation in our region. Vietnam and ASEAN countries will continue to strengthen our relation with all major powers, including the United States, China, Japan, European Union, India, Australia, etc. Vietnam and the United States are looking forward to celebrating 25th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic relations. With goodwill and efforts to build trust between the two countries, Vietnam and the United States are opening up new pages of our deepened and substantive cooperation for the next 25 years. There are a lot of rooms for the two sides to expand and consolidate the cooperation on security, defense, economic areas, as well as regional and international issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Well, thank you all for coming today. I agree with the ambassador that the future of U.S.-Vietnam relations is bright. I think our discussions today, starting with Assistant Secretary Shriver and our two panels and ending with Ambassador Nuck, have shown the depth of our strategic and security cooperation and other areas that we can deepen our relationship. So thank you all for coming, and thank you, Ambassador Nuck.